Instructions by Josh Shepard to split the difference. We're not starting at 8:30 so that we can let as many of you gather in this room as possible, but he said do start at 8:45, so I am saluting Josh Shepard and starting. Good morning. My name is Gregory Luco. I am Chief of the Library of Congress's National Audiovisual Conservation Center, headquartered at the library's Packard campus in Culpeper, Virginia, about 75 miles southwest of here, and still encompassing all the activities, traditional activities of the library's motion picture and broadcasting and recorded sound division. Welcome to the Montpelier room of the Madison building. There's a connection there. In fact, if you go down into the lobby, you'll see a statue in a hallway of James Madison, which is the federal government's official recognition of our fourth president, as is this building. So welcome to the Library of Congress. You're actually going to get two welcomes for the price of one this morning. My colleague Eugene Flanagan will be talking about all of the national planning and coordination activities that the library does on behalf of preservation activities, including radio. And I'll be focusing a little bit more on the internal work that the library does in the domain that you'll be talking about here today and tomorrow. The National Audiovisual Conservation Center is part of the Library Services Unit of the Library of Congress. It's the largest unit in the Library of Congress, about 1,500 people, which provides all the national library services of the Library of Congress. The Preservation Center in Culpeper is probably the largest single division of the 50-some divisions within library services, within the Library of Congress, and we're one of the few here that works in all three of the ways in which any archive, library, or museum can structure itself. We collect by format, we serve by function, not only acquisition and cataloging, but also preservation, and we collect and provide access and focus on subject. In this case, the history of radio, its creators, its industries. That's all what we do at the Packard campus. We acquire, we catalog and describe, we store, we preserve. We have 3 preservation laboratories in Culpeper, one for film, one for video, and one for audio. And we serve to our research patrons here and through a range of access initiatives. This is the 10th anniversary of the NAVCC. That's our acronym for National Audiovisual Conservation Center. So we've been at that for about 10 years. We're also written into the legislation that authorized the National Film Preservation Board and the National Recording Preservation Board. The NAVCC is part of that law that written in as to help implement the national plans that the Library of Congress has published in the last couple decades for recorded sound collections and for our nation's moving image heritage. The collections of the Library of Congress itself, the audiovisual collections, we have some 3.6 million audio collections, sound recordings, including many hundreds of thousands of radio hours and items. We collect commercial, public, and government-produced materials from national networks to local stations, programming of news, dramatic programming, music, sports, talk radio. In fact, talk radio actually embodies one of our more recent initiatives. Another law that we have that the Library of Congress has is called the American Television and Radio Archive Act. It was part of the Copyright Act of 1976. It mandates that the Library of Congress establish and grow an American television and radio archive. We've recently expanded the regulations governing that act to include a unique authority to be able to capture unpublished audiovisual transmissions from any format, from any venue, whether satellite, cable, off-air, off internet, satellite radio, FM radio, and a number of years ago we began capturing political talk radio in general, with a special focus on on political talk radio. That's an activity still ongoing. You can see what we've been capturing over the years at our Recorded Sound Research Center website. So we're constantly have radio on our minds as we continue to acquire and preserve our audiovisual collections. Our newest major activity you're going to be hearing more about throughout the conference and this afternoon especially, is our collaboration with WGBH Educational Foundation up in Boston. We're going into our third year now of having assumed the responsibilities for managing the ongoing preservation development of the American Archive of Public Broadcasting, AAPB, an initiative established by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting a number of years ago. And about 3 years ago, WGBH and the Library of Congress assumed responsibility for continuing that. To date, we have ingested into our data center, our digital archive at the Packard campus, over 71 radio collections from around the country, with numerous more in the pipeline being developed through grant initiatives and negotiated agreements with radio stations. This broad initiative to capture publicly funded media in the United States is off to a great success, and I hope that many of you will be attending this afternoon's 2 p.m. 50th anniversary celebration of public broadcasting in this country. You're going to see an all-star cast of dignitaries in this room later this afternoon. So you'll be seeing a lot of other Library of Congress staff here and tomorrow on various panels that can fill you in on more details. I want to conclude just by giving some thank yous. I consulted with Josh Shepard earlier, and we do have a number of people that I would like to thank now, not only on behalf of the library, but also the leadership of the National Radio Preservation Task Force, including all of the Radio Preservation Task Force conference directors, project directors, caucus chairs, and all of you participants, the Association for Recorded Sound Collections, CLEAR, the International Communication Association, National Communication Association, NPR, the Maryland Institute for Technology and the Humanities, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, the National Council on Public History, Memnon, and the National Recording Preservation Foundation. And a number of individuals, Michelle Hilms, Conference Director, Sam Berlovsky, Stephanie Sapienza, Trevor Munoz, Ross Johnson, Pieter Bierstecker, Julie Rodgers, Justin Wynn, Laura Sotabara, Jan Jones, Mike Casey, Laura Sawyer, David Park, Paige Hunter, Trevor Giles, Brandon Burke, Jane Curry, Sean Van Coor, Wendy Shea, and a special shout out to Christine Eric, the Communications Director for the task force, for the article in the Washington Post that appeared yesterday on this gathering and radio preservation in general. And of course, the library needs to thank Josh Shepard for his tireless efforts in developing the task force. And of course, I know he wishes he could be here today as well, the founder of the task force, Chris Sterling, who I'm sure extends his warm welcomes to all of you as well. It is an amazing network of a couple of hundred institutions that have come together to create this digital humanities empire of creators and archivists and academics who are working together to focus on radio history and preservation. I commend you all and I welcome you all. Thank you very much. You'll introduce yourself, but I would be remiss if I didn't just contribute to introducing Eugene Flanagan, who is the Director of National Programs and the National and International Outreach Unit of the Library of Congress. Eugene.
Good morning. Actually, if those of you politely sitting at the back, if you'd like to grab a seat, now's a good time. Won't force you, but there's plenty of seats here and to the side. So thank you, Greg. As he says, I'm Director of National Programs, and it's my great good fortune that some of those include the National Recording Preservation Board and the National Recording Registry and their film counterparts. We had the meeting of the Film Board yesterday, and we also had a terrific event promoting the work of the board and the registry when there was a conversation between the Librarian of Congress and the Director, Christopher Nolan, last night. And I'm hoping we sort of mirror that to help support and promote the Recording Board and Registry. And the board meeting is coming up in December. The registry will be announced in March, and so we'll be working to see what we can do along similar lines. The library is delighted to welcome so many institutions, as Greg mentioned, 200, and individuals that are registered, 300, to participate over the next couple of days. Yesterday we saw forums, panels, and workshops take place at the Woodrow Wilson, National Public Radio, and the University of Maryland, and here now at the Library of Congress, or as the online conference schedule describes the library, the big boxy building with pillars. But it obviously helped, because most of you are here today. So given the depth and breadth of participation, it should come as no surprise that this radio preservation project is one, and maybe the largest digital humanities and media initiatives in the discipline today. And for those of us in cultural institutions, big boxy buildings with pillars, used to marking progress in decades, this has come to pass in relatively short order that I find very impressive and commend everybody involved. In 2013, just to give you a sense of the pace, under the auspices of the National Recording Preservation Board, the library released the Library of Congress National Recording Preservation Plan, a comprehensive blueprint and call to arms to save America's recorded sound heritage for future generations. The report drew from findings that many recordings of radio broadcasts were untraceable, that numerous transcription discs of national and local broadcasts had been destroyed, and that little was known of what still existed, where it was stored, and in what condition. A year later, a key recommendation was to implement the Radio Preservation Task Force, and this was formed in 2014 to spearhead the effort to identify challenges and develop strategies to collect and preserve American radio broadcasts and content. And in 2016, the task force convened its first national conference. Subsequent collaboration in the years since has seen several projects launched, including the Public Memory Project, a national project to preserve the history of public media, a national project to study and preserve Cold War communications history, a beta program for publicly accessible big data search engine to locate archival collections, and aggregating information about hundreds of archival collections across the country. And here we are today, in late 2017, at the second annual conference, ready to fire up the engines for the year ahead. So why is this pace, this sense of urgency important? It's important because the task at hand, to quote the title of an Atlantic article, is saving historic radio before it's too late. A sentiment that was repeated in, as Greg says, the Post's article yesterday. We know that radio, like film, has played a vital role in the last 100 years of our history. From the mid-1920s until the 50s, radio was the nation's preeminent source of entertainment and news information. And today, despite the multiplicity of generations, options, devices, and platforms, there are still more than 14,000 radio stations in the United States, and radio is still a major source of information that 93% of us listen to, even millennials. I was surprised, 91%. Radio is an irreplaceable part of our sociocultural heritage, a key part of our social memory, and a ubiquitous, if perhaps underappreciated, force in our daily lives. As you all know, and much better than I do, and I appreciate your patience, radio preservation presents unique challenges. The magnitude of the material produced, its ephemeral nature, the deregulation and consolidation of radio stations, the lack of technology to preserve early broadcasts, general institutional neglect, emerging formats, and underrepresentation of diverse genres are all contributing factors in the crisis facing the preservation of America's radio heritage. So much was never captured, and much that was has since disappeared. Our preservation consciousness has, of course, been raised in recent decades, and many libraries and archives have acquired collections of radio broadcasting recordings. But there's been few systematic efforts to collect commercial radio broadcasting and to document and preserve the entire range of extant broadcasts in private and public collections. For the latter, happily, of course, there is now the American Archive of Public Broadcasting. But that still leaves the vast expanse of commercial and independent nonprofit radio that is found at both the national and local levels. This essential work remains to be done, and this is why we're here today. The task force and its 3-day conference is the first national attempt by mass media historians and archivists to assess the history and record of radio in the United States. And for that, and I second Greg in this, I applaud Chris Sterling, Josh Shepard, the task force, the conference committee, and all of you here today participating over the next couple of days over the 22 odd sessions. Thank you very much, and the best of luck.
I should probably, this is where you get up and disperse. I should probably give you a little guidance for that. There are 4 sessions that follow. One of them stays in this room, so if you're here, stay. Dining rooms A and dining room C are just right on the other side of this wall, just a few steps away. And the Mumford, which is where the other session is being held, is the big room right behind where you registered this morning, where the registration desk was off the elevators. So here to there, and the Mumford, that's where the 4 sessions are meeting. Good luck. There, that's dining room A and the west dining room. Dining room C is this little room right behind that wall over there. So for future reference, if you're not going there right now, dining room C.
Such nice weather, isn't it?
I'm Michael. I know. Nice to meet you.
Okay.
You guys are actually in camp, huh?
Yes.
Do you have any PowerPoint or files or anything?
We're going to use everything on,
No, don't do that. Just, okay, go ahead.
what's the,
You're going to use everything on your laptop.
yes, on one laptop.
You have the adapter for that?
No, I'm getting one from Josh. He's coming with the dongle. No, I knew I didn't have one, so I asked Josh, and he's running from his car to get one. I asked him already. He forgot it in his car. So this, we're going to have a little bit of if I leave it like that, are you going to be okay looking at it? Okay. Okay. Sound like audio? Yes, I do. Can we play a bio? Oh, we charge for this? Ready for me to test it? Where's your file? Good morning, everyone out there. It's good to see you. Thank you for being here. I'm just giving a slight little note here. We're getting a late start, obviously. We're waiting on a couple of panelists still making their way here. So we'll begin here in just a moment. And thank you. Thank you for your patience. Good morning. Okay, I think we're going to work around our technical hiccups here. Thank you so much for your patience. This panel is entitled Indigenous First Nations, looking at media archives in general, coming from our tribal communities. And since we're getting a late start, I just want to also just mention that we're going to keep the presentations a little tight with some room, hopefully, to leave for some of your questions. This panel wraps up around 10:45. My name is Jenny Monet. I'm a tribal citizen of the Pueblo of Laguna, which is a tribal nation in New Mexico. I'm an Indigenous journalist, and I'm so honored to be here at this awesome conference where we get to talk and nerd out on a topic that I really love, which is Indigenous media. Allow me to introduce the panelists, and then I'm going to assist them in working around all of the files that we have here today. Starting from my left, we have Lina Ortega. She's a tribal citizen of the Sac and Fox Nation out of Oklahoma and is speaking to us from work that she does with the University of Oklahoma. To her left is Melissa Begay, who is here representing Native Public Media. Loris Taylor was originally intended to be here, and Melissa works very closely with Loris, and I know that she will bring in the same remarks that Loris would have today about Native Public Media and tribal radio. To Melissa's left is Michael Pon with the Smithsonian Museum of the American Indian. I'm looking forward to your remarks as well, Michael. Thank you for being here. To Michael's left is Simon Moya Smith, an independent journalist and soon-to-be author of his first book. Simon also is going to be speaking to us from his recent work of Indian Country Today, which actually shuttered in early September. And so it'd be very interesting to hear what you have to say about the archives happening from Indian Country Today. And then finally, last but not least, we have our discussant, Amalia Cordova, who comes to us from the Smithsonian Folklife. And she's really going to bring context to the greater Indigenous worldview of how these narratives are shaped and formed. So without further ado, I just want to get started with some of the conversation here today. And Melissa, if you would like to come up here, I can certainly help with navigating any of the presentations here. Please. Is this how you like it? Yeah.
Yat bene. She Melissa Begay and she Lizatlin and Schnego Kia Ani Bashes Chin. She a Dashachedo Tachini a Dashanella. Tudines Dizada a Nasha. Out ego a Stanishla. Good morning. My name is Melissa Begay. As you heard Jenny mention, I am with Native Public Media. I'm a member of the Navajo Nation in Arizona. And I'm here today filling in for Loris Taylor, as Jenny had mentioned. She was unable to be with us today. The presentation today is going to focus on endangered collections and the need for expanded academic study on the cultural history of radio and in general, the history of media serving Indian country. Not much has been compiled or collected, but what we do know are bits and pieces of an incredible story. It is generally perceived that Indigenous peoples' culture and traditions are kept alive through oral traditions, generation to generations for thousands of years. When you think about it, that's a lot of information to retain and to share. However, not all nations use oral traditions. Some nations use birch bark to capture their writings, and there were and are other examples of written language used by Indigenous people. Between 1809 and 1821, Sequoyah, also known as George Guess, created the Cherokee syllabary. Sequoyah, a Cherokee silversmith, simply just wanted to write his own name, like other silversmiths want to sign his work. He first tried pictographs, but found that this would have required thousands of symbols. He designed a symbol for each syllable in the Cherokee language. The Cherokee symbol, or the Cherokee syllabary for the written Cherokee language came into being in the late 1810s. And in 1828, the Cherokee Nation adopted the Cherokee syllabary. And in 1911, the Smithsonian preserved the language. The Cherokee Phoenix was the first Native American newspaper, the first issue published in English and Cherokee using the Cherokee syllabary in February 21, 1980-28. Elias Binet was the first editor of the Cherokee Phoenix. He named the Cherokee Phoenix as a symbol of renewal for the mythical bird that rose to life from the ashes of fire. The nation founded the paper to gather support and help keep members of the Cherokee Nation united and informed. It was also a platform to discuss political decisions that would eventually result in the Trail of Tears. And it was a part of a movement to help the Cherokee Nation create self-governing institutions in the new capital of Ecota. Other tribal nations beside the Cherokee also started to print newspapers. They include the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Creek, and were influenced by tribal leaders and gave an official voice to the elders and leadership. Most newspapers were tribally owned and few owned by individual tribal members. In 1935, the second Native American paper, the Shawnee Sun, was published both in English and Shawnee, also using the English alphabet. It was suspended in 1838 and resumed in 1841. By 1858, there was a Chickasaw and Choctaw Herald, and by the 1840s, tribes were investing in official papers. Both tribal papers and Native writers were active through the 1850s. However, as the political situation of tribes shifted to that of assimilation and allotment, publishing had weakened and declined. To this day, tribal officials or the tribal government usually control tribal newspapers. And as you see on the slide, a little bit history and timeline of the newspapers starting from Sequoia to the 2000s. It's also important to mention Myrta Edelman was the first Native American woman to own a mainstream newspaper. In 1898, Myrta launched the Twin Territories, which focused on tribal Indian territory in Oklahoma. Myrta's sister, Ora Edelman, later became Reed, served as the editor and chief writer for Twin Territories. Between 1900 and 1940, publishers and editors supported assimilation, controlled most public, From between 1900 and 1940, publishers and editors who supported assimilation controlled most publications. A number of tribal publications were started during this period. A few of them are the California Indian News, 1935, the Winnebago Chieftain, 1905 in Nebraska, the Claremore State Herald, 1905 in Oklahoma, the Rossville Reporter, 1913 in Kansas. Now moving on to Native radio. KYUK was the first tribal radio station, went on air in 1971, followed by KDKB in Pine Hill, New Mexico in 1972. 46 years later, in 2017, that has grown to approximately 59 tribal radio stations across Indian country. Native radio is a powerful network of individuals and organizations that support and encourage one another. Radio stations are often owned and operated by Native American and indigenous groups, many on tribal lands, in tribal communities, and also a few in urban areas. Radio programs and series are developed by Native producers, focused on Native issues and cultures. Native radio is significant to both Native and non-Native audiences for a number of reasons. It gives indigenous communities a powerful voice that reinforces a sense of community through the lens of their own language. It can provide news from the Native point of view and health programs focusing on local issues and local needs. It can broadcast music and cultural programs that support traditional and non-traditional Native artists. In 2013, Peggy Berryhill, a 42-year veteran radio producer, stated, "We love native radio. The announcers sound like us. We hear the latest music, we hear the latest news, we hear our language, and we hear emergency information that can save lives." Native people through the world had little, if any, opportunity to hear their language over the radio. Majority of cultures dominated the airwaves, and most nations saw little value in supporting indigenous cultures in any form. It is through tribal radio tribal members can hear their language and possibly rescue it from extinction. Since radio was an oral medium, it appeared to be ideally situated for this purpose. In 2012, 21 stations broadcasted in their tribal language. A year later, that grew to 36 radio stations broadcasting in their tribal language. And you see a few examples on the screen there. Native radio strengthens the retention of Native and Indigenous languages. It supports arts and cultural initiatives. It airs discussions of current affairs from perspective of Indigenous people and continues to bridge the cultural divide. Moving from Native radio, I want to now highlight some Native Americans in mainstream media, Native American journalists. Tanya Beebe, a member of the Kolitz tribes of Washington State, sorry if I pronounced that wrong, was one of the first Native American hired by a non-Native owned TV station, KIRO TV in Seattle in the early 1970s. Haiti Kaufman, a Disperse tribal member, started her broadcast career on college radio at the University of Minnesota. In 1987, she worked for Good Morning America as a special correspondent and substitute news anchor. Then joined CBS This Morning in 1990, where she also served as a special correspondent and substitute anchor. We have Mary Kim Titla, a member of the San Carlos Apache tribe, who became the first Native American television journalist in Arizona in 1987. She worked for KVOA in Tucson and KPNX in Phoenix, Arizona. These pioneers, Native television journalists, led the way for many others, such as Andy Harvey, Charlie at City, and others. And then we have our television station, FNX, First Nation Experience, airing in 2011. The Cheyenne Arapaho television station in 2012 in Oklahoma. And then just recently in 2014, the Gila River Broadcasting Corporation, the Gila River Indian Community in Arizona. We also have tribal web-based media. Indian Country Today Media Network launched in 2001 and is a news aggregator. Rescast, a native video and music sharing site created in 2005 by the Coeur d'Alene Tribal IT Department. According to Rescast's website, this is a place where they can create their own tribal shows, report on their own tribal programming and their own native content. It is their hope and their intent that tribal people will use technology's greatest strengths to preserve the greatest truths. And then we have IndianCountryTV.com, which streams news from Indian Country and Indian Country TV. And then the Chickasaw TV. Chickasaw Nation TV is a high-definition online video network owned by the Chickasaw Nation, focusing on tribal history, traditions, arts, cultural, and services. The website consists of 9 channels: government, commerce, news, history and culture, arts and humanities, The website currently contains hundreds of short videos covering Chickasaw government programs and services, events, and issues. This map displays Native American media today. In yellow are the radio stations across Indian country. Purple are podcasts. Red are weekly podcasts. Blue represents newspapers across Indian country. And then green represents blogs by Native Americans across Indian country. We know that new technology are changing Native radio and media in radical ways. Broadband internet provides opportunity for online streaming, satellite radio, and distribution of programs. Also, low-cost digital technologies such as tablets, cell phones, and other devices have broadened access to tribal media as well. So good things are happening, the good things are going on in Indian country. There is a small collection of Native media, and Native public media encourages academia to be more open to collecting and archiving tribal media. Again, thank you so much for inviting Native public media here today. Again, my name is Melissa Begay. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa, and what an appropriate introduction to this panel discussion, I think. I really appreciate the overview. Lena, would you like to go next? Sure. Okay, that'd be great. Let's go ahead and put this up here. And would you feel comfortable being here at the podium? Okay. Great. Now, again, let me know if I can assist you with any navigation in getting your files. Let me just put this up here. Okay, and now yours is not this one. This is yours. And I believe we downloaded it as well, correct?
Yes.
Okay, here it is. There's that. Now, to access your audio files, escape. Sorry. And if you just move the cursor down, I'm going to pull up iTunes.
Okay.
Okay? Does that sound okay?
Yeah.
Great. I'm going to bring that down and bring your, there you are. Okay, thank you for that transition.
Okay, all right, thank you. Minwap and Nikonik. I'm really thrilled to be here today to talk about the Indians for Indians, our radio program. It started on April 1st in 1941, and it was broadcast from the WNAD AM station right on the campus of the University of Oklahoma. And from the very beginning, it was a very popular show. It was the creation of Don Whistler, who was a Sac and Fox Indian, and he was also chief of the tribe at that time. He had been educated in Sac and Fox country. He grew up in Sac and Fox country, and then as a young man, he attended the University of Oklahoma, and then he also went to the University of Pennsylvania and worked in the museum as a curator and also as a lecturer and performer. And so these are a couple of photographs of him from when he was a young man. And on the right, you see him wearing a headdress, which is not what Sac and Fox warriors or chiefs traditionally wear, but he would wear it during his performances. And he would, whenever he was lecturing to Boy Scouts and other groups in Pennsylvania, he performed dances and songs from other tribes, not just the Sac and Fox. This photograph is from later in life, and he's talking to one of the anthropologists on campus at our Natural History Museum. And I think this photograph is from about the same time that he would have started the Indians for Indians Hour, and he was also its host for its first 10 years, from 1941 through 1951. And he invited Native Americans from all over the state. He had a wide network, evidently, in central Oklahoma, in western Oklahoma, and some getting into the eastern part of the state, but maybe not so much, because there are a few tribes that really aren't well represented in the radio show. It was broadcast on Tuesday afternoons for half an hour at 1 o'clock, but it was called Indians for Indians Hour, popularly. So that's just the weekly schedule. This is a program schedule from 1948. This one is also from 1948, and it talks about the popularity of the show. It says, more and more Indians are finding Indians for Indians to be one of their favorite series. The programs include real Indian music, songs, and dances presented by representatives of tribes from all over the state. Don Whistler arranges for the appearance of these groups and is in complete charge of the series. And he was very explicit that this program was being put on by Indian people, and it was for Indian people, and he never wavered from that. However, once he did invite someone, sometimes, usually it was groups, sometimes individuals, he let them take it from there. He would introduce them, he would make some comments, and then he would let them do whatever they wanted to, sing whatever they wanted to. There was also a lot of, the program mostly was performances of music, and I'll get into details in that a little bit later, but also it was spoken too. There were speeches, there were prayers, and so once people were there, he let them do what they wanted. The only thing is he didn't want anyone getting into political discussions. Indian country politics can get kind of, always has, probably always will, can get kind of heated sometimes. That was not the format of the show. The Western History Collections at OU is one of the special collections in the library, and we also house the university archives. So that's where some of this material is coming from. We're fortunate to have Whistler's logbook that he created for planning his show. And this is a couple of pages from it. And the arrangement of the book is kind of interesting. He would put paper in this binder, and then as time went on, he would add to the top of it. And so this first page from the first programs in 1941 is actually at the end of the book. So we have his first show April 1st, and then the second show on April 8th. You probably can't see it, but it says Yellowfish, a Cockney. And this is one, I actually don't know if Yellowfish sang on this program, but he did talk. This is one of the recordings that it no longer exists. Not every program was recorded, or the recordings were saved, and then I think there were some that were recorded and they've been lost over time. So anyway, Yellowfish had participated in the Battle of Adobe Walls. So this is 1941, and I believe he's in his 70s at this time, and that battle was, I believe, in 1874 in Texas. And it was kind of the last stand, if you'll want to put it that way, for the Comanche. And so he was there. He was a teenager when this was going on, and so that's what he's talking about during this episode. So it's tragic that that recording doesn't exist. The content of the show, as I said, it mostly was music, but it was a variety of music. It was powwow music, so it included war dances, what we now refer to as intertribal songs. It had round dances, war mother songs, 49 songs. It also had religious music of different kinds. Some of it would be Christians singing Christian hymns, but it was different denominations from churches from all over the state. And so some of these hymns would be from more of the eastern tribes, like the Creek or the Seminoles. And then you would also have more of the western tribes in Oklahoma represented. Rainy Mountain Church in Kiowa country is one example. And so these groups would be, they would come and perform. There would also be stomp dance music. And then also ceremonial music, traditional tribal ceremonial music, which is a little surprising to me. Some of the songs, for example, are Sundance songs from the Cheyenne or the Arapaho tribes, and it astonishes me that they actually perform that on live radio, and we still have these recordings. So that's something that I'd really like to talk to the tribe about. What do you think of this now? As far as some of the spoken content goes, some of it talks about history. There's a lot of it in a tribal language, and so we don't necessarily know what they're saying. And there's a lot of tributes to veterans, and school groups would often come and perform too. And so sometimes we have students talking or they're singing. It's like Whistler gave them an opportunity for both the elders to perform and to participate in this show, and then also for the young people to do that as well and kind of show their elders that they're carrying things on. So I'd like to go ahead and play a few clips for you. I'm not certain this is going to work correctly, but let me see. Yeah, I did escape.
Just get us there faster.
Okay.
Here's the iTunes.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome, and then just click on whatever.
Okay. This first one I'm going to play is Whistler himself, and so I'd like for you to hear his voice. And he normally didn't venture into politics, but he does have some commentary here. We're not going to hear it all just because of the length, but he's talking about the NCAI urging Indian people to write their congressman about a proposed bill that was in the House at that time.
Indians for Indians with Don Whistler.
Oh, Nikan Kishkikashanina. This is the 353rd program of the Indians for Indians, our Kishkikai speaking. Before we start on this program, which is going to be a continuous affair without me butting in any place, make one little announcement here. It seems that someone is always introducing bills in Congress asking for things for Indians without ever taking the trouble to ask the Indians whether they want it or not. The National Congress of American Indians just written me a letter saying that there is now in the Senate a bill, H.R. 4725, that's H.R. 4725, to confer jurisdiction on the several states over offenses committed by or against Indians on Indian reservations. The National Congress of American Indians seems to think that...
Okay, I'm sorry to cut it off, but it goes on for a little bit longer. So he always started his show off by saying, "Aho, Nikan, Keshkikosh Anina," and he's saying, "Hello, friends." Keshkikosh, that was his clan name. It is I speaking, so that's what that translates to. Another one. This next clip is one of the early broadcasts. It's from 1943, and the speaker is Satok, who is Kiowa. At this time, in 1942, he's 96 years old, and he lives to be 107 years old. His name was Hunting Horse in Kiowa, and you can only imagine what he must have seen in his long lifetime during a period of enormous change. So here's a clip of him speaking in Kiowa. Yeah.
Go,
Okay.
go, como.
Okay.
They don't try, go, como. Go, como. They don't try, go, como.
He's singing several types of songs, and he doesn't start speaking until a little bit later. I apologize, but the way that I made the clips doesn't really transfer onto another person's computer. I can fast forward it, but of course it's going to cause some squealing in the meantime. Do you think I should try that or just leave it?
Actually, move the cursor. Do you know about when, where the time code is?
Yes, it's about 13.
There's 12:42, 13.
Okay,
Let's try that.
okay.
Oh, go, don't, oh. Hey, go, got, don't, go, yeah, got, so, yeah, got, so, go. Ya sông san thì ai go ba go ma yo coi của châu của châu phê thì châu kia ba châu trả đi ô yo ya ông ô yo thì kia cũng như cái pan ma ya cũng đã ông ma châu cũng một châu ya sông san thì go châu.
I'm sorry, I probably cut him off in the middle of a sentence, but as you can hear, he has a very strong voice. He's speaking in a very animated way, and he speaks for several minutes. Some of these speeches are combinations of just talking about a certain topic, and sometimes they'll go into a prayer. So I think this clip is I would like to know what he's saying. Really, it's a simple matter of finding out. The Kiowa language is taught on campus, and so we have Kiowa instructors. The campus's tribal liaison is Kiowa, and so he speaks the language, and so the library, I'll talk about this a little bit more, but one of our things that we need to do is to draw in some of our colleagues from across campus to achieve better descriptions of these episodes. So the next one, I'll just do one more. And again, I'm going to have to advance it some. I think I see how to do it now.
He didn't. From there, more livable. And we're and honored thy mother. My name is Thomas.
Okay. I'm going to pause it just for a moment. Thank you for bearing with me. As I said, school groups sometimes participated. The Pawnee Indian School was a frequent group that would come and visit and perform on the show. Sometimes they would sing. In this particular clip, the students are very earnestly reading an essay that they had written for school where the general theme has to do with advancement under education. So this particular boy is named Thomas Roughface, and I'll start it.
My name is Thomas Roughface. I am 12 years old and in the 6th grade at Pawnee Indian School, Pawnee, Oklahoma. I am a member of the Packard tribe. Indians today live in a world where old conditions are changing, rapidly changing. Yes, old conditions are changing to new modern ways. Indians do not live in tents and teepees out by themselves as they used to do, but they are living in modern homes and must live and work under modern conditions. Indians today even own stores. Today some Indians own very large and good farms. They earn their own money. Today you see Indians driving around very good cars, going to colleges and working in offices. Indians get good jobs and earn good money, but do they know how to spend it?
So he goes on to talk about how Indian people are learning to use banks and also in agriculture. learning about erosion and so forth. This clip is from 1948, some years after the Great Depression and the dust storms in that part of the country. So anyway, I just wanted you to hear some of the participants' own voices and get an idea of the variety that's in this radio program. I'm going to go back to the slideshow now. How do I hit play? Do I hit play?
Yes, right there.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. The one clip that I didn't play is Solomon Kent. It's also from 1948. And he speaks about honoring veterans. And this is something that's very important to Native Americans. It's a frequent topic in the show. And I find his pattern of speech very interesting because it's repetitive. It takes him like 4 minutes to say that around Memorial Day, people are remembering their loved ones who have passed on, especially soldiers who have served and given their life for their country and for their families, and it's very moving. I grew up hearing people speak like this. I still do, but working where I do and in daily life, you don't hear people speak like that quite so much, and so it's just interesting to hear that type of pattern of speech. This is just a photograph that was taken of the show. I'm assuming that it happens around Christmas because I think the design that's on the lady's book is a Christmas tree. Unfortunately, in our files, this couple is not identified, and we don't have the date of when the photo was taken. The show is extremely popular. It was from the beginning, and it continued to be popular. This article is from the student newspaper in 1953. And then, unfortunately, Whistler passed away in 1951. And when he died, he was still host of the show, and he was still chief of the tribe. And so I'm assuming that he passed away suddenly. But the show continued even after his death. It was sponsored by the Sequoia Club, which is the Indian club on campus, and its staff sponsor was Boyce Timmons, and they carried it on through the 1950s and the 60s and into the early 70s. The show had become kind of an institution to Indian people across the state, I think. There are files of all these requests that people had written in for announcements that they wanted on the show. And sometimes people would write in requesting to be placed on the schedule. They did this regularly. And so these are just a few examples. One of these is the Sequoia Indian Club announcing their homecoming dance, the Native American Church, the actual state organization, announcing their annual meeting. The signal evidently reached into Kansas because we have a letter from the Wichita Intertribal Club announcing a dance. And then there's also other correspondence that students from Haskell would write in. And also there were student groups that would come from Wichita to perform on the show. And then we have a whole lot of these handwritten postcards where someone is just announcing a birthday celebration. They're going to play a hand game to celebrate this young man's birthday. And this is more of the same. We even have we have a government memo wanting the open house for a new Indian Health Service unit to be announced. The Hominy War Mothers announcing the Veterans Day celebration. And so Hominy, this would be the Osage tribe. And the Kiowa Gourd Clan announcing one of their events. And they have their own beautiful, very elegant-looking stationery. So it's just fascinating to me to see the variety of forms that people use to request announcements. We have telegrams, too. These particular requests all date from the early 60s, 1960 and 61. So the show is still very vital. This next one, this is kind of changing gears a little bit. it was from that same file, so I assume it's from the early 60s, and it says it is a matter of policy for WNAD to erase all tapes unless specifically requested. And so I think this explains why we don't have recordings for all the episodes. OU has the most complete set. It's a very unique holding. The Library of Congress has a couple of reel-to-reel tapes that we do not have from 1943, and they also have a copy of reel-to-reels of the 1941 through 1950 shows that they made because OU had sent the original acetate disc here to be copied, and then they sent back archival quality copies on reel-to-reel. Unfortunately, it is not known what happened to the acetate disc. Our records say that they were retained by LOC for preservation, and their records say that they were returned to OU. And so I'm not blaming anyone. This has happened. This has been the case for a long time, but it's just a mystery what happened to those original discs. And then as time went on, the originals are recorded on reel-to-reels. But we don't have all of them. You know, if you think about it being a weekly show, there should be, you know, many reels. But for the decade of the 50s, we only have about 30. It's the same situation for the 1960s. And then we only have 7 or 8 from the early 1970s, and those tend to just be the annual anniversary shows. But we also have about 30 that are labeled unknown, and so clearly we need to find out when they're from and what the content is. In the process of preparing a grant proposal to have the reels digitized, I took some photographs to send to some of the vendors because I'm wanting to outsource the digitization of this collection. I do not, neither I nor my staff have the expertise to do this. And so these are just a couple of the photographs that I had to send to them. And so the remarks were, the tape is coming unwound, it's not fixed, this is a preservation concern. On the right, you can see the boxes, they're still in their original boxes. We haven't rehoused them. We provide access to the show through cassette tapes. Copies were made to cassettes in the late 1980s, I believe, and that is what we use when people come into our reading room and request to listen to them. Okay. And they also, that's what we use to digitize things just on a one-off basis. This last slide just shows our description, how much it can vary, and this is one of the access problems that we experience with this program. On the left, we have one that's very detailed. It lists all the performers. On the right, it says singers, undated, unidentified music and dances on tape 128. So it is true that we can listen to the cassette tapes and get all this information, but it needs to be done systematically. And also I have a concern that the cassette tapes are close to 30 years old and they're going to break. Also, I have noticed the cassette tapes are not always a faithful reproduction of the reels. There's like one episode will just be broken, right? It'll stop suddenly and another one will start, so it's interrupted. So if you're interested in seeing the inventory list, please contact me. I'd be happy to hear from you. And moving forward, like I said, I'm trying to apply to CLEAR, to the Council on Library and Information Resources, to their Recordings at Risk grant program to have it digitized and also to get better descriptions. And we're also going to feature the show in an exhibit in the main library next year, and we're hoping that as part of that we'll be able to draw in more members of the campus community and the state community to get better descriptions for the show and do a better job of preserving this very unique treasure. So thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Lina, for bringing up some very interesting dialogue to this conversation. Michael, would you like to go next? Great. But you don't have to step up here, but whatever you'd like.
Oh, well, in that case, I'll just stay right here.
Okay.
I'm Michael Pond. I'm the head archivist at the National Museum of the American Indian, and I was very gratified when I was asked to be on this panel. Is this? You gotta go close. Sorry. I was gratified to be asked to be on this panel, but I also was kind of confronted with reality, which is that NMAI doesn't have a lot of radio in our archive, which is kind of a blind spot for us. So let me tell you a little bit about the National Museum of the American Indian Archive and some radio programming that we have done as a museum, and then talk about why I think we need to turn our attention towards collecting radio programming. So the National Museum of the American Indian became part of the Smithsonian in 1990, but the actual origins of the institution date back far longer than that. George Gustav Heye, who founded the museum, began collecting Native American material culture in the late 1890s, and almost from the beginning conceived of his collection as a museum, and then did actually open a museum in 1916. And his concept, as was sort of the fashion of the day, I guess, was that Native Americans were dying people. They were going to be assimilated into mainstream culture. All evidence of their heritage would be obliterated, and it was up to wealthy white people like him to collect the evidence of their heritage and make it available to other white scholars. And for decades, that's how they proceeded. I think that one of the really fascinating and maybe untold or undertold parts of the story of the National Museum of the American Indian is that transformation from being an institution largely for white people, by white people, intended for sort of a colonialist audience, to being an institution run largely by Native people, who conceives of our audience and our constituency as being the Native people of the Western Hemisphere, that we are an institution dedicated to documenting the lives of the Native people of the Western Hemisphere, and largely in support of revitalizing those cultures, of making cultural heritage available to community members. So we very much think of ourselves as the stewards of the cultural heritage of the Western Hemisphere. When George Gustav Heye began the museum, and for many, many years after that, they were really focused on this kind of unrealistic idea that there was sort of a perfect moment in the past that truly represented what Native people's lives were really like, and that they were going to collect and document that stuff. And so for a long time, archival materials were not really part of the picture, because they were looking for archaeological materials or some sort of ethnographic materials that met a kind of standard that they as curators set. So our collections, our archival collections, are not nearly as robust or as historical as our material culture collections. And we also have the benefit of being part of the Smithsonian, which has the National Anthropological Archive, which dates back to, their collections date back to the 1860s. So we don't try to collect anthropological records. So in terms of the archive of the Museum of the American Indian, we've kind of been triangulating towards a niche. And that niche is that we document the contemporary lives of the Native people of the Western Hemisphere and seek to demonstrate the connections that people make and the context that their contemporary lives have with their traditions. And so we do this by collecting the personal papers of artists and writers and leaders and activists, and the organizational records of Native American civil rights organizations such as the National Congress of the American Indian. We have about 50 years worth of their papers. So so what I'm kind of driving at is that we seek to contextualize people's contemporary lives and how the traditions that they have been raised in and the continuity of Native culture informs those contemporary experiences. Well, radio is a really great medium for that. It's interesting that I learned about the Indians for Indians Hour because one of our staff people, a man named Ed Shoopman, who runs our National Education Initiative, used to work at the Library of Congress in the 1970s, and I believe that he's the person who might have been responsible for having the Library of Congress preserve those acetate recordings. He told me about going to Oklahoma and hearing the Indians for Indians Hour, and what a perfect example of how Native people throughout the world, and the Western Hemisphere is no different. They've always used the technology and the mediums at their disposal. This gets to what you were talking about newspapers and broadcasting. So we do have collections of media producers. We have, for instance, the records of a really fabulous Native American filmmaker and documentarian, Phil Lucas, who made really terrific programs in the late 1970s. He made a series of television programs about the portrayal of Indians in Hollywood and on television. And when you watch this images of Indians, when you watch it today, it is exactly as current and informative as it was when it was made. Which is kind of a sad statement about the progress that mainstream media has made in representing Native people, but he did a really great job of making a fantastic series of documentaries about that. The Museum of the American Indian has made, as far as I am aware of, only one foray into radio production ourselves, and it was in the late 1990s. I believe they were published in 2001. It's a series called Living Voices, and it was produced by two longtime staff people, Elizabeth Weatherford, who just recently retired, but for over 30 years ran our film and video public programs, and Kevin Lewis, who also just retired, but Kevin ran a really great program bringing Native artists in to work with collections, which is just a really special thing about NMAI. It's one of the more gratifying things about working there. So Living Voices was 40 short profiles of Native people and leaders, contemporary leaders. It's kind of assembled from more than, I think, 100 separate interviews. And in addition to the 40 episodes that are in English, 20 of them were also in Spanish. Because, as I've mentioned several times, we are a hemispheric organization. We represent and collect Native people of the entire Western Hemisphere, including Hawaii. We don't actually collect Hawaiian materials, but we do programming about Native Hawaiian people. So that program, Living Voices, is freely available online. You can listen to it. You can buy CDs or no, not DVDs, just CDs of it. But the original recordings and the production materials are also available. I mean, obviously, these are in-depth interviews that were edited down. That's sort of the nature of media production. So we are aware as an institution of the value of broadcasting, of the value of radio. It isn't an area that we have collected with a great deal of focus, but I ask all of you as participants in the Radio Preservation Task Force and people who think about this all the time, to please think of the National Museum of the American Indian as a repository for radio programming. We are fortunate to have a really fabulous, incredible collections facility, the Cultural Resources Center, located in Suitland, Maryland, about 7 miles from here. That's where the archive is based, and we have the infrastructure of the Smithsonian to help us with our preservation concerns. So please think and help me learn more about indigenous radio programming and collecting opportunities. So I'm here, and if you'd like to contact me, I have business cards and would love to hear from you and speak with you and learn about the potential collaborations or collections that may be out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Simon, would you like to make some remarks next?
Is this on? Sorry, I'm usually on my third cappuccino by now, so I only had a small black coffee, so this is painful. Hihani washte, samana machiapalo nama lakota, le iuha uhipiki washte. My name is Simon Moya Smith. I'm a reporter, I think, and I'm not objective. I give my opinion. I bring the native lens. You know, I mean, that's the thing is like, somebody once asked me if I was so you cover Indian country, you just cover native news. Like, no, I'm a native reporter, and I bring the native lens to news. And, you know, by the way, happy Native American Heritage Month. It is. This is Native American Heritage Month. This is the time where we get to recognize us and our resilience. That we survived the founding fathers. We survived westward expansion. We survived boarding schools, massacres, murders, rapes, all of it. And this is a time where we get to celebrate the fact that we survived all these people who have statues to themselves all over this district of Christopher Columbus. And people forget that. People don't, I mean, we just go and just say Washington, D.C. No, it's Columbia. This is the district of Christopher Columbus. And what's the sports mascot? I mean, think of the message that we're sending to people every day to know that we're in the district of Christopher Columbus, and the sports mascot is a reference to a time where we were bountied. And at the same time, we're the most likely to be killed by cops. And people don't know that. We're here talking about media, right? And the fact that we're so still canceled out of the American conversation across the board. I've gotten phone calls from my fellow African-American colleagues saying, hey, I'm about to go on Fox Business. Can you tell me a little bit about natives? I'm about to talk to you. And it's like, then why are you going on? Nobody, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't call my African-American colleague and say, hey, I'm going to go and talk about Black Lives Matter. No, I'd be like, I would sit down and you should be doing this. But that's the problem, is that we are the uncomfortable reminder of what this country has done, is doing, and will continue to do unless we're included in these discussions. So one thing, I just went on a tangent. One thing I like to start doing, though, is we have to recognize that all of us are sitting here right now still on indigenous territory. And they are not here predominantly not because they decided to leave voluntarily. That just because they weren't white Christian, they were aggressively and forcibly removed. So let's recognize that we are all right now, because I'm Oglala, my people are in the Pine Ridge Res in South Dakota and the Black Hills, even I'm a beneficiary of aggressive native removal in this territory. So we need to recognize our privilege in that sense. And we hear that all the time, you know, it's like, oh, my family's had this home for 6 generations. Well, it's still Indian land. You know, and we like to talk about, oh, my people are like, you know, I used to hang a lot with a lot of veterans in Denver because my grandpa was a veteran, so I'd go to these places and they'd say, well, we've always fought for this country. No, you haven't always fought for this country because it hasn't always been in America. There are restaurants in Italy still pumping out biscotti that are older than this nation. And we miss that in the language. And that's I guess, my part in this is that the native voice and lens and language, that's what we're talking about, is the preservation of some of our languages that are on, that like some elders will not speak because of trauma. My master's thesis included an Oglala woman who would not speak the language because she was so traumatized, because she went through boarding schools that it gave her a sick feeling in her stomach to even speak her language. It was so traumatic. And so I didn't plan on being a journalist. I just thought how white people use language was so fickle, and it was entertaining to me that they could say something and not mean that. And I'm like, okay, I have to figure these people out. And that's when and I knew that as a kid, because they would, no, that's not what I meant. This is what I said, but that's not what I meant. And that was so interesting to me, that it was so fickle. It was so thin, and it melts in water. And that became, I, again, didn't plan on being a reporter. I actually was a speechwriter for a state senator trying to repeal Columbus Day in Colorado, where the holiday was founded by Irish, not Italians. Remember that. And I was offered a position with the Rocky Mountain News. And then I realized how much the native language and lens pushes back against the American narrative and makes people uncomfortable. And yet we're the ones that are referenced as being politically correct. We're not politically correct. If you want to read anything politically correct, get an American history textbook. And sorry, I'm under strict rules not to cuss. And sometimes when you get fired up, I don't know many people who get fired up and say, what the heck? So, you know, I got in trouble for something, and actually, you know, that's how I got into journalism. Was I was pulled into an office at the Colorado State Capitol, and they said, you wrote this thing about Columbus Day, and you can't do that, and you need to take it down. And if you want a future in politics here, you got to take that down. I'm like, I'm not an editor. I filed it. You got to talk to my editor. But I realized how that shook the foundation of what people think they know, right? And listen to the language that we've agreed on certain things. You know, for example, we know that the R word, I'm not going to say it, the name of the team here, is a racial slur that means proof of Indian kill. But yet, you can go on CNN, anywhere, NPR, across the board, and people will say, some people believe it's a slur. Really? The fact that how we, like, the idea of it is defined as such, yet we make this argument why. You have to put this qualifier in there why. And it's the same thing when it comes to photos. If you just go on any website and it's an indigenous person in regalia, they'll still say costume. We just heard a tape of a young boy in the 40s trying to teach people who he was then, and we're still having that same conversation today. Why aren't you listening? Why is it so hard when the native voice comes? Why does it make people shudder? Because it calls into question privilege. The idea that the indigenous people did survive everything that, it's Thanksgiving, right? People don't want to talk about the idea that we saved them, that they were cannibals. They literally weren't digging and planting crops. They were digging and looking for gold. So when it came time to eat, you know what they did? And this is factually true. They dug up Indian graves and ate the flesh. That's Thanksgiving. We took care of them while they were stealing from us. And after a plague fell through in the area, there's this whole idea that the pilgrims showed up and that they tilled this. They didn't till anything. They came and the land was already ready to go. But a plague came through because of the Spanish and the Dutch. This is the story, our lens, again, our voice. It's very uncomfortable for people to take all of this in because it does call into question everything you think you know. I mean, and I made some notes here, but I just really want to emphasize that now we are taking media and using it to provide you the truth, because it has been used before against us, propaganda. Everybody knows Wizard of Oz, right? Frank L. Baum. Do you know what he used to write? He used to write columns about how we need to kill Native Americans, all of them. We've wronged them. It's a Dorothy, and you know, okay, but I'm going to kill Indians. That's literally what he did. He was writing this beautiful little story that everybody likes to show to their kids, while this guy was calling for the genocide of Native Americans. Media was used against us to demonize us and strike fear in people. Now we get to use it to provide you the truth, that we aren't merciless Indian savages as it's written in the Declaration of Independence. So we have this opportunity to even close the gap that they tried with reservations, out of sight, out of mind. But now there's that geographic distance isn't there when you have, when you have this, right? I mean, now you have the native voice in your pocket, whether that's written, whether that's photography, just right away. So I think one of the problems that we're still facing is just getting the Native voice, like, welcomed. I'm sorry to say that. Just welcomed, like the Native lens about these. You guys can probably go to a website right now and read something about like a diversity list, and we're not included. We're still in the other category. We haven't even moved out of the other category yet. You can go in a room and people, like, I was at NBC News, and they were celebrating their diversity, and they went down the whole diversity list and didn't mention Natives. I was just at Columbia Journalism, where I got my master's. There's not one Native. I mean, these are real problems, and it sucks that we have to take it upon ourselves to launch our own websites, our own podcasts, to talk about race and police brutality and sexual assault, all of that. Why aren't we included? That's the question. Why are Native Americans still canceled out of the American conversation? What does that serve? It doesn't serve anything for any of us. If anything, it affects the situation. So, I can go on like this, and I won't, but I will take questions later. I think the last thing I did want to say was that my focus of my work, again, is to provide also a platform for other Natives. So when I was at, Indian Country Today is on hiatus, and that sucks because that was a huge platform. And so you imagine all the stories that are not being told right now, and all the stuff that's happened in the past month and a half, and all of those stories that aren't being told in our about our communities. And I tried to provide that platform to people anytime I could, whether it was at Standing Rock or, if it's Oak Flat, etc. Now my question is, where are you getting it? Where are you guys getting your Native news? Can you go to the New York Times? Where are you getting it? And think about that. Anyway. I'm done.
For someone with one cup of coffee, that was pretty fired up.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
And also, I think it just really reemphasizes why we're here and talking about this, the importance of these stories that have their roots so far back, and yet how much work there is yet to do. Amalia, please, yes, come, dear. Let me just log back in really fast, and I have your presentation ready to go.
Sorry.
And just keeping an eye on the time, it's 10:31.
Yes, 10 minutes.
Yeah, thank you.
How do we make this viewable?
You just start working.
Okay. Okay, there we go.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Mari pu lamian pu kompucha inche Amalia. I'm greeting you in Mapuzungun, which is the Mapuche language from the Wellmapu territory, which is currently known as Chile and Argentina, which is where I was born. And I'm a language learner still. And I want to also acknowledge the traditional territory, the Piscataway Nation, on which we are gathered here today. And I think Simon's presentation just, opens up some of the struggles that are happening across the rest of the hemisphere in terms of the right to communication, which is very tied to the right to exist. I've been working with Native media through video mostly, but there's a predecessor of video in Latin America in particular, which is Native radio. In many places in Latin America, the Native radio initiatives are illegal because of the concessions of the airspace. So a lot of the radio is pirate radio, or radio is working on borrowed space. And radio is also a space that's really important because it's more affordable than video and making a film. And it's also can be deployed at any time when something happens. And something did happen recently on October 8th, 2017. Radio producer Efigenia Vasquez was shot and killed at occupation of traditional territories in southern Colombia, Cauca. So I had been on that radio like a month and a half before, and the Renacer Coconuco radio, which reaches not just the community, but spills over into the local city of Popayan. And again, it's an important channel, just like Indian Country Today and all the other wonderful initiatives we've heard about today, of really getting the lowdown, the real story on what's happening in our communities. And these land occupations that were happening in traditional territory are to get back land that the government has already promised to return through constitutional recognition of indigenous territories and through specific agreements. And Efigenia was just covering the land recovery, and she was shot. So it's very sad that we still have people who speak out are putting themselves in the spotlight and in the front lines and endangering their lives. So there's a lot at stake, and people are willing to do anything to get the message out when it's about survival. So, local indigenous radio is very important for local organizing, but increasingly we have migration to urban centers, and those urban centers are not always in our own countries. I myself migrated. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the other indigenous voices in the airspace or in the web space right here in the United States, and one of them is called Quito Hatari. Quito Hatari is a Quechua language radio based out of the Bronx, and it's based out of this wonderful basement that Segundo en Camarca was able to access and create a studio. And this became, along with First Voices Indigenous Radio, the only indigenous radio programs out of New York City. And First Voices Indigenous Radio is actually a program that has been on the air for a very long time through the Pacifica Network, run by Tiokasin Ghost Horse, and his is a global indigenous program. So I've often gone to that radio to translate. I've brought participants from the Native American Film and Video Festival who also bring urgent stories from home to share, and I interpret on the air. So it's really interesting when you have these collaborations that allow us to hear what's going on with our brothers and sisters across the continent. So Quito Hatari is kind of a Latin American counterpart to First Voices, and it's become a native space. And they welcome hip-hop artists who are visiting New York, and it's multilingual. It's primarily in Spanish and Quechua, but they also welcome speakers of the variants of Quechua from across the 7 countries in the Andes that speak the language. But also, if you're native and speak English, then they'll translate into Spanish or Quechua on the air. And this is broadcast via Tambo Stereo on the internet, live, 8 o'clock at night on Fridays. So Quito Hatari has come to the Folklife Festival, and we've had a pop-up, and they've been broadcasting and teaching Quechua and playing Andean music, and that's the first image. This was their stand out at the Folklife Festival this summer. So it can be done now with other means, but we have to also look at language not just as an isolate, something that is spoken by a group of people in a remote region. Quechua is bringing people together. There's the diaspora of migrants from the Andean area and from the Amazonian areas in Latin America, and they're coming together because of the use of the language through the radio program. And that's been a really beautiful initiative. And then also in another way, connecting some of the topics that we've just heard today, I think scholarship is really important. We have these archives that are scattered, but it's the scholars who find out and sometimes link them together and can help produce better metadata so that we can actually know what is where. So I think that's one thing that has to happen. Everyone should, all these institutions, and it's wonderful that OU has done it, should look inward and say, well, what native resources do I have? And is it a special collection? Is it scattered? Is it even a collection? Are the resources just sitting there, right? So that's something where NMAI, I think, has a role to play in sort of advising on sort of how do we pull a magnet through and just pull all the native resources together and then start thinking about tagging them in ways that are easy to find. I trolled the whole Folkways and Folklife website, but I found that a lot of the resources have the original names. For instance, I couldn't find Purepecha, but I found Tarascan. So the sort of renaming, adding that into the metadata is important to find your ancestors in the archive. So I think that's an important point too. And the names of the languages have also changed as we use the languages of our own creation and not the names that other people gave our people or our languages. So this is an effort I wanted to share too, which is there's a Mapuche scholar who's the head of the Native Studies program now at Austin, Texas. And he's been working with a radio show in Santiago, Chile called Huichanyanay. It means wake up, get up. And it's been broadcast continually, weekly, since 1993 in Santiago, Chile. It was actually founded in 93. And it's broadcast in Spanish and Mapuzungun. And the idea was to reach the Mapuche audiences that have migrated to the city where they are becoming assimilated and dispersed. So this is a radio show that really has, again, like Quito Hatari, brought together communities that are diasporized and brought them together through the language. And some people have even revitalized the language by listening to the show because it's completely bilingual, right? So they have actually, since they've been recording steadily for 24 years on cassette, right? They have an archive, and they've started a GoFundMe campaign to raise $6,000 that they need just to build a safe space for this archive. And they were working in different radio stations. They didn't have their own stations, so they had like a feminist radio station sponsor them, then somebody got a job at another one, they moved over there. They've been on Christian radios. I mean, they've just been wherever they can be to broadcast, right? So I wanted to show this video. How do I do the notes? I want to see my notes. I want to see this link.
Oh, can I help?
Yeah, I think that's
I don't know
down
how
there.
to do how Melissa got
I think it's
her
presenter.
notes, but I think I can just
There. Okay, it's the Facebook. Thank you.
there.
Okay, can I click on that? Will it come up? I have to copy it.
Okay. And it's 3 minutes, right?
Yep. All right, that's it.
Hello, I am Luis Cárcamo Huechante. Now I have the honor to be in the home of Elizabeth Wenchual, Josepa Iyal, and their family here in the Cerro Navia district in Santiago, the capital city of Chile. And this is a moment for all of us to thank all of you who have made contributions, significant contributions, to help the Mapuche radio show Vichage Anay.
Chale. Marimari Kampuche, Unyanya, Lamien, Manyun Kalin, Tvachi Chawen Meo, Tvachi Dungo Meo, Taman Kayun, Tvachi Dungo, Yin Fenshen Manyun, Katain Lamien Meo Malebalu Fachante, Manyun Kalin.
Chaltumay Lamien.
Hello everyone, my name is Gianpaico. We are so grateful for your cooperation and contribution to this show radio program. Your cooperation is very important for us to support our radio program, which is called Wichangana. Thank you.
Inche Josepa Iyal Huachukeo Pingen, Tpata Inche Tañi Puche, Tañi Polaimani, Potom, Nipo Ñahue, Nifamo, Nipe Ni Cárcamo Huechante. Mañum Klen Yamai Tañi Amolenta Tfachi Dungo, ni Uchambra Amnia Fiel, Tfachi Dungo, Uchanganai Pinelo, de Omaya in Kiñapichiruca, Piteinta in Alemnia Fiel, Chique grabación Mlelo, Uchanganai Meo, Teoma Po Lalo EP, Pumari Keshu Sipanto, Veichido Meo, Vita Mañum Klen Tañi Amolenta Tfachi Dungo, Tfachi Keyuntati.
Elizabeth Wenchual and Josepa Iyal have expressed their gratitude to all of you for your contribution here in their home. Something else you want to add about what Elizabeth and Jose have said?
I think it's done. All right, thank you.
Yes.
It's just 10:40, and maybe we can share the link. It's on Facebook. Is their Kickstarter? It's a GoFundMe. Okay, we can find them there. I thank you so much, Amalia. I really appreciate your contributions, and to the panel for just having great patience with the technicalities here, and to you, our audience, thank you so much for being here. I'm sure some of the panelists are here for questions if you have them. Unfortunately, due to our delay, we did not have time to make time for Q&A, but I think people can. We have 5 minutes? Yeah. Oh, we have 5 minutes. Okay. Oh, I thought the panel ended at 10:40. Okay, we have 5 minutes. So if there is a question from the audience to any one of the panelists, yes, in the back, please.
In terms of the preservation of broadcast, is there a general belief that there are recordings that exist around the regions that one might actually find, some kind of concentrated effort made to do the search?
So the question is, in terms of broadcast, is there a searchability protocol?
Is there a belief that there are recordings that exist that could be found and potentially archived and made accessible?
Yeah.
Or is there a general belief that too much of this material is lost?
Lena.
Yes, I do believe that there are recordings that exist that need to be found. I don't know that there's a whole lot of them as far as the Indians for Indians, our radio program goes, but it was an option for participants to request a recording, to request a tape, and so I'm sure that they did. And one of the things that I hope the exhibit will accomplish is to give us a forum for reaching out more to the communities of the state to identify the photographs, to help us develop better descriptions of the content, and then also to identify if there are other tapes that exist out there. OU does have an NEH-funded grant right now that has to do with preserving music recordings, so it's not talking radio. And they have not had a lot of response to their surveys, you know, asking people what are the issues with preserving some of your recordings that you have. So that's a different project, but they're kind of related. I can talk to you more at length if you want to. Yeah.
Yes, please.
Are there issues in terms of recordings or other kinds of cultural artifacts that would touch danger spots in terms of what other people should have access to? You know, sometimes there's very particular usages.
Oh, sure.
Well, I think Lena touched on some of that too with her presentation and some of the ceremonies that were documented, and really having that kind of insight about what you actually are coming across. Anyone on the want to speak to that?
Well, no, if we're talking about like even like language preservation, and you think of like Rosetta Stone, who's making the money off that? You know, I mean, when I go into a store and I see Rosetta Stone and it's an indigenous language, and I'm like, who gave you permission? You know, or did you do that on your own? You know, and it's just like we see with like our Nypl ceremonies, our sweat lodges, and you can see people charging $70 to go. And there was that a couple years ago where he killed a bunch of people. One guy did. So, I mean, it's about being responsible, but the problem is when it's our things, people think they could just take them, whether if it's our language, our ceremonies, everything. But they can't, and we're trying to push back against that. So yeah, there's a level of responsibility, but there is that sense of privilege that I can just take this and do what I want with it.
I think presentation yesterday by the Wikimedia people, and
yeah.
They seem to have created a space where things can be annotated and made searchable, but at the same time restricted to who actually has access to it.
Yeah, I think you're touching on the concept of cultural sensitivity of like traditional knowledge systems, and you know, at a place like a university or a museum, you know, in order to be responsible stewards of materials, we have to be responsive to those kinds of community concerns. And it can be really complicated. I mean, there are thousands of Native communities throughout the Americas, and there isn't a single Native America. There are hundreds of tribes and communities that believe different things. Right. I think that the maybe where this isn't as quite as big an issue with radio is just that it's been broadcast in the first place. I think a lot of people are very sensitive to what goes out to a broad audience and what doesn't. Now, that is, those attitudes have changed over time. Maybe in the 1940s, people, even Native people, weren't as necessarily concerned about that. But I think increasingly that's something that people are really aware of.
And I would add really briefly that that's why we have organizations like the Association for Tribal Libraries, Archives, and Museums who are probably working specifically on those topics.
Thank you, Amalia and Michael, for that. And
one last
There's
question.
a question.
Okay, quickly.
He's,
Thank you from Colombia, South America, but I live in Texas. And I'm very glad to hear this kind of conversation. And I appreciate so much what you said. I would like that many more people to have the opportunity to hear this. It breaks my heart to see empty chairs.
yeah.
Preservation is not only on technical recording, it's on the minds, especially the young. If we don't have enough adults that are interested in seeing this type of conversation, I would say many high schoolers in Texas and many other places will be thrilled to be in a place like this that represents so much. And to hear some of the voices that you have. That's the preservation of the brain, of the heart.
Right on.
Thank you. Muchas
Thank
gracias.
you.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone. I'm sure some of the panelists are here for your questions if you'd like to speak. Thank you. Thank you so very much for those audio files.
Okay, great.
Take off your badge, you won't get that reflection of the light. You can introduce six up here? There's six on your panel now? There were always six. 4, 5, 6.
Actually, there were 7 at one point. Hi, if you were on our next panel as either a speaker up here or a discussant down there, please get a little closer. We want to get started in just a minute. Aha, there you are. Sorry. Well, we only have 6 seats up here, so I mean, David is over there. Maybe if the Carlene was here a moment ago, yeah, it would be in the front row. Yeah. No, we had, at one time this panel had 7 people, but it doesn't anymore.
And now we're at 6.
Okay.
6 here, right?
Yeah. I mean, the discussants, you know, there are like 3 more people who are going to sit out here. You just be part of the back and forth. Yeah. Yeah. Or maybe just, or you know, if they stand up, come around, or I can give you the, if it would help, you can come up to the podium too. So, okay. Okay. We need one more up here. I haven't met Charles Hardy yet. Is he here? Yeah. Is Charles Hardy here? All right. Have any of you seen Charles Hardy? I've not met him yet. I don't see him. Oh, he's on this panel.
So you have more people in the audience that are going to speak?
Well, Betsy, David over there. There's one more person. I hope she sits in front. She was here a moment ago. But they can share the microphone. Yeah, yeah. All right. Still waiting on Charles Hardy. I want to give him at least one more minute, but then we'll begin with or without him. All right, why don't we get going? My name is Matt Barton. I'm the curator of recorded sound at the Library of Congress. Usually I'm down in Culpeper, but spending a lot of time up here this week, which is a nice trip down memory lane for me. I used to work in this building. And I'm also the current president of the Association for Recorded Sound Collections, ARSC, until May, when Carrie Janelle, who's president in waiting, takes over. So we're starting a little late. I don't want to talk too much beforehand, rather just jump right into the introductions. Because I'm lacking in imagination today, we're going to do this alphabetically. And unfortunately, the first person in line would be Charles Hardy, and I haven't seen him yet. So we hope that he makes his way here. But I am going to skip to the next in line alphabetically, and that is Jonathan Hyam, Curator of Music Division, Rodgers and Hammerstein. Then we have Matt Karush from George Mason University and Hearing the Americas. He's also editor-in-chief, the Journal of Social History, and professor of history at Mason. Elena Razlogova from Concordia University, where she is an associate professor of history and also is the author of The Listener's Voice, the early radio and the American Public, and she's co-editor of Radical Histories and Digital Culture issue of the Radical History Review. Mark Williams, who is with, right here, Dartmouth College and the Media Ecology Project. And finally, Thomas Witherspoon of the Shortwave Radio Audio Archive, of which he is the founder and curator of, as well as the Radio Spectrum Archive. And we also have three discussants who are sitting down here in the front row, who will be jumping in and leading things once everybody gets to give their short talk here. And they are Betsy Peterson, American Folklife Center, and Carlene Stevens, and David Walker from Smithsonian. So, alphabetically, I think it's to you, Jonathan Hyam.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you to the task force for inviting me. It's wonderful to see everybody, so good morning. So I think the panelists and myself all agree it's a bit of an open forum in a way to talk about generally digital curation here. So I thought the best thing I could do is to tell you a couple of the imperatives that we have at the New York Public Library that feed into this, and maybe then hopefully raise some questions from everybody so we can start thinking about what we need to start thinking about. So anyhow, I want to point out there are a few things. So I'm the curator and part of the Rodgers and Hammerstein Archives of Recorded Sound, which is vast. Next to the Library of Congress, it's the largest in the US. We have everything from performing arts materials through spoken word, industry recordings, all phases of recorded sound. So it's a sort of a completist archive in that sense. Of course, we've got thousands of radio broadcasts, and the first thing I'll say, at least about the way our collections are managed, and this is probably covering turf that's brought up already in this conference, but just not just cataloging, but even inventorying the variety of radio programs, the subjects, is a very complicated task to begin with. Many of our radio recordings have not come into the collection as such. They came in with individuals' collection, for example, perhaps a famous stage actress or actor, for whom all of their sort of great radio broadcasts were captured on transcription discs, but they're not necessarily identified that way. Just like news broadcasts have come in through all kinds of means. Government recordings, of course, but we have thousands of copies of just home enthusiasts recording radio from the 50s and 60s, and again, not necessarily identified as such. So there's a big work in just discovering the holdings we already have, and strangely enough, even holdings that we feel like we've already got a pretty good amount of intellectual control over. There are a lot of people packed into a 15-minute radio broadcast on a disc that may have 2 or 3. So there's a lot of work to be done there. That being said, what we're finding from a sort of digital curation standpoint is we've been finding that there's a very practical need for, first, I would say, staff level, quick access to the types of recordings we have. Because a curation project often at a place like the New York Public Library is focused either one, on an exhibition, or two, maybe trying to reconstruct some collections or build something out for a special purpose, in particular educational efforts, which are among the more recently really prioritized efforts at the New York Public Library, and of course everywhere, but it speaks well to the theme of this conference, I hope, too. So, to give you an example, like many places, the New York Public Library is in the middle of building out a meaningful interface for the public to stream digital audio and moving image in particular. The earliest iteration of the streaming portal for materials at the New York Public Library was actually something that was innovated through the Jerome Robbins Dance Division at the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts, who acquired a grant from the Duke Foundation to develop a portal to stream moving image of dance. That access point was fascinating because it was designed with curatorial tools built into it. You could kind of create multi-tracks of images. You could pull in materials from outside, like YouTube or other sites, and integrate it with those tools. It was really well received. Student populations loved it. General researchers loved it. But as all things institutionally, as the digital program started to get bigger and bigger, that was kind of folded into a larger platform, which has now seen a variety of iterations, some more successful than others. However, it really is moving in a good direction, and I mention this for a few things, because one is the curation part of it was initially offered up as a public tool, which was really cool. But I think what we were finding was staff was loving the kind of quick and dirty access to lists of files that either we could use because it had the proper sort of file codes that we can recognize by eye, or even just the internal files that hadn't gone to cataloging yet, because if we knew what they were, we could do a lot with them very quickly. So I think we're at a place where, while we are really looking forward to building out public tools for things like digital curation, we're also really looking at how useful these things are fundamentally on the sort of interior side of things to let us get a grip of what we have and make that material much more useful to the staff much more quickly. I would add one other thing, just a very kind of specific thing. So the current digital platform at the New York Public Library, digitalcollections.nypl.org, is starting its next phase of being aligned with our MMS is to have MMS markers that when materials go into an exhibition, so these are things that are digitized outside of a public request, a researcher order, that sort of thing. These materials will be tagged at the front end of their clearing, so all the rights get cleared, all of this, so that it can be put into this digital portal. Now they'll be marked with, or soon to be marked with, markers that will tell us this was in a particular exhibition. So you can go in and now the public and the staff can sort things on the OPAC to sort of show you, oh, these were digital objects that were part of this physical or digital exhibition 4 years ago. And it's very useful for both the public and staff in that regard, and provides a really nice shortcut for developing educational programs. Okay, the last thing I'll say, and I'll get out of your way, is another thing that's been useful for us to think about how we want to manage and curate our digital files is, as I've mentioned before, in the context of educational programs. One of my colleagues, Danielle Cordovez, who's here, has been working with a grant called an NYPL Innovation Grant, something that's awarded to staff internally to do something new and interesting. Danielle has been working on that project to build out some technology that will basically, basically be a box of recordings that you can take into a classroom and stream locally. That's an element of control that we're increasingly comfortable with in terms of protecting materials, but also being able to curate through just the assimilation of files into whatever kind of program you want to take with you, just out into a classroom or out into a branch library. Keep in mind the New York Public Library, although we're representing the research side of it, also has essentially 90 lending libraries that we serve in different ways too. So these sort of simple, I want to say simple because the mechanics are not, but the simple use of digital tools to kind of aggregate files, see things more quickly. It's kind of the human cheap version of big data, helps us put things together very quickly and makes them portable and stretches the boundaries of what's possible. So I'm going to stop at that. Those are just some loose things, but to give you a sense of where we're at and what we're thinking about, at least myself and my colleagues who are here. We can't speak on behalf of the whole library, but nobody really can do that. So anyway, thanks. You want to take questions at the end? Or?
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. And I think next we have Matt Parris.
Thanks very much.
You want to do it from there?
Yeah, can I stay here?
By all means.
Will that work?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm here, I'm a professor at George Mason University, but I'm here representing the project Hearing the Americas, on which I'm sort of a co-lead historian, I think is my official title. But this is a project housed at the Center for History and New Media, the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media at Mason. We have a digital projects for the public planning grant from the NEH. And the idea is to put together an accessible digital public humanities project aimed at increasing users' understanding of the early history of recorded popular music. It's actually not radio at all, so I feel a little out of place here, but in any case, I think it raises some overlapping issues. The inspiration for this came really from the availability of a huge amount of recorded music from the period between the 1890s and the 1920s, thanks principally to two collections, the National Jukebox from here at the Library of Congress and the University of California, Santa Barbara Cylinder Audio Archive. So between those two collections, users have really immediate and kind of amazing access to more than 20,000 recordings from that early period in the history of recorded music. And both me and my colleague, Mike O'Malley, who's the other lead historian on this, have made efforts to use that material in classes with different amounts of success. But one thing we noticed is that even the most well-educated of our students, the students who came to the material as music fans, music buffs, interested in music history and quite knowledgeable about music history, were basically unable to make much use of that material unless we provided a great deal of guidance, and that really, from a pedagogical perspective, wasn't particularly a shocking realization, but it did bring home to us the fact that even though these collections have made these recordings, they put them right at your fingertips, and they're very well sort of tagged and searchable, and it's just they're both very efficient websites to use. But despite that, for somebody who's not pretty significantly well-versed in both that period in music history, but also that period in history, it's quite difficult to make sense of that material. It basically all sounds the same to people, and they have trouble kind of making anything out of it. Maybe I'll say a word about why that might be. But in any case, that's where we're coming in, trying to put together what's basically, I guess, a website that's providing a great deal of, that will hopefully provide a great deal of contextualization to sort of help users make sense of these collections and sort of use them, right? Make use of them. The two collections that I mentioned give users immediate access to a really wide range of different forms of music: marches, tangos, ragtime, foxtrots, cakewalks, Hawaiian serenades, opera, ethnic songs, lots of ethnic humor, for better for worse. Minstrel show routines, also for better for worse. But the whole panoply of American popular music before 1925, and they require contextualization in at least, I think, two main ways. First of all, we hope to provide a lot of significant contextualization on the issue of the formal properties of music, right? So that users could begin to start to hear the recordings in a way that they probably can't when they first start streaming. So this is, topics from syncopation, improvisation, being able to identify certain kinds of rhythms, certain instrumental techniques on different kinds of instruments, band arrangements, etc. And obviously, sort of that project of contextualization raises issues of digital curation, right? It raises kind of challenges of how to do that effectively. Then the second kind of contextualization we're interested in is more historical, right? Trying to make understandable and audible the multiple contexts of race, class, gender, nationality that enabled a given performance and that structured the way it was heard at a particular time. And just to give you kind of a broad, this is very much in the planning stages, but just to give you a broad sense of the sorts of themes that I think hopefully we'll be able to make contributions to, I guess. The history of capitalism and technology, right? These recordings have a lot of potential to shed light on that. The history of the music business in that period, but also of recording technology. The history of race and constructions of race. I already mentioned the prominence of minstrelsy, for example, in the collection, but it's, that is a really rich and complicated topic because, as probably many of you know, that's not just, these are not just white blackface performers, but also African Americans who kind of reappropriate that in interesting ways, that genre, if you will. And then finally, and the reason the project is called Hearing the Americas in the first place is we have a transnational component to this. The majority of the songs in both of these collections were recorded in the United States in places like New York and Camden, New Jersey, and Philadelphia. But the collection also features, both collections feature recordings made in Mexico City and Buenos Aires and Havana. They also feature Latin American musicians, composers, and genres, right? And they make visible the transnational roots of U.S. popular music in ways that may hopefully surprise visitors to the site. So this is, the Hawaiian roots or contributions to blues and country music in the U.S., the Argentine, Cuban, and Brazilian roots of jazz, the key role of Caribbean and Mexican musicians in the North American soundscape. So those are some of the issues that I think the collections can speak to, but kind of aren't yet. I mean, unless you're bringing a great deal of knowledge to them at this point. As I say, very early planning stages. We're just kind of mapping out right now what the site architecture will look like, but it will provide users kind of multiple routes through the collections. In other words, you can follow individuals, you can follow genres, you could follow songs, and sort of plan your own itinerary through the collections. One thing that we do hope to include that presents a real challenge from the digital curation standpoint, I think, is kind of annotated listening guides, so that we can sort of point out to you as you're listening things that you're hearing or might be hearing. That's in its early stages of planning, but I think that's a real challenge for us, which I'd be happy to hear suggestions about. I mean, I think the current idea is something like SoundCloud. I don't know if some of you, I'm sure, have seen the annotations that you can do on SoundCloud. So that's a kind of model that exists, but this is definitely a work in progress. So that's all I'll say at this point. Turn it over.
All right, next we'll hear from Elena Razlagova. Okay, thank you. And she'll be presenting on Freeform Radio. Oh, there we are.
So I was
have the power.
Digital panels for digital metadata, and everybody had a PowerPoint, so I made one like half an hour ago. I got worried, and now nobody here has a PowerPoint. Great. And my colleague, Fenwick McKelvey, who's also at Concordia University in Montreal, points out that public and free repositories of audio materials and video materials as well compete with commercial cloud services like Spotify, Netflix, and others, and only certain material ends up in the cloud. And even if it does end up in the cloud, algorithms tend to choose materials that are published by commercial corporation rather than public services. And I know that this problem is important for museums and libraries as well, because I was at an excellent digital workshop yesterday at University of Maryland, and Efi Kapsalis from the Smithsonian had a slide showing that at Smithsonian archives, the artifacts are viewed by about 10,000 users, but Wikipedia gives them 10 times more use, because Wikipedia is a public project, and the Smithsonian, even though it is a government institution, very well known and very popular, it doesn't have the same discoverability as Wikipedia does. So my project is basically based on getting live recordings of music performances at freeform radio stations throughout the United States and also Canada. And it turns out that these recordings are mostly very informally archived, obviously, and they usually are locatable more at recording companies rather than radio stations themselves. So we started working with Carpark Records. And so far, the files look kind of like this, a bunch of WAV files with no metadata whatsoever, and we need to research how to contextualize these and how to link them to particular radio stations. On displaying them, we collaborate with radio station FMU, WFMU from New Jersey. It's a cult radio station, fairly known to people who are interested in obscure, non-popular, and weird music. So in that sense, we already get hardcore music listeners. And because we're more interested in independent labels, we actually, this is our core audience, basically. Independent labels, independent musicians, so that works very well. But how do we reach more people? So we're gonna, the page so far, I'm not gonna show you my page because it's not ready yet, but our page will look kind of like this. So it's not aesthetically pleasing in a way that, say, Pitchfork pages, but it does have attraction to these hardcore listeners. And this is the list of radio shows from FMU. And sometimes there are images. Okay, so I decided to look at what small labels, small venues, and rare music promoters are doing. And a lot of things are happening that are very interesting. So one option is to issue these recordings. So this is a record, a special record published by at Death by Audio Space in Brooklyn, which closed recently, a few years ago. And this is a vinyl of the last music show at the Space under the title Start Your Own Fucking Show Space. I just want to say that in this conference. So the coverage in the music press for this release was fairly high. So not just archiving, but releasing vinyl, I think, is vital for these kind of projects, because material production and material like events such as a record launch do a lot for these kind of projects, I think. Another option is collaborate with commercial. Bandcamp is a commercial entity, but it is geared towards independent musicians, and it is known in independent music community as a fair institution to collaborate with. And Discord label that is actually from DC recently released all of the recordings, including demo recordings, on this platform. And in conjunction with this recording, with this release, they organized a roundtable where they invited music journalists, musicians themselves, and label representatives to discuss the history of the label. So I think that kind of coverage is also very interesting because not only it allows you to release and contextualize metamaterials such as liner notes, memoirs, station memos, or posters, but also it generates historical data via oral history or documentary practices that then can be useful for historians. So this is another example of a vinyl release. This is a Tangier label from Montreal, nonprofit organization that preserves and disseminates archival recordings of Quebec avant-garde artists, mostly free jazz artists. And it's also a DIY project by just one person or a few people. But they do the same. They digitize recordings of public performances by free jazz musicians in the 60s and 70s that are quite amazing. There are people that actually went to proletarian areas, like to worker areas and farmer areas to perform free jazz, which is really hard music to hear. And then they would give lectures about how to hear it before, and they would end by collective performances with the people in the audience. So all of these recordings exist, and they're all being digitized by this organization. But then once a year, in conjunction with these archival practice, they release a vinyl recording to promote their project and also make it an event. So these are these releases of the records. And then finally, another option for musicians as well is touring with the music. So Awesome Themes from Africa, probably most of you guys know what that is. It's a project of Bram Shimkowitz, who started it as an MP3 blog in the early 2000s. And he makes available African music that's not otherwise released on major labels. And this is kind of an anti-Spotify project. I love these projects because they make music available that would never be on Spotify. So he started with the blog, and then he created a label that releases some of this music as recordings, and 50% of the profits go to African artists. Also on Bandcamp, as you can see. And at the same time, he travels and he performs DJ sets of that music, and he basically explains his project, which is controversial as well because, well, there are issues of how much should you give back to the musicians, how much can you profit from this kind of business. So he creates a discourse about this kind of music. And I think in some ways, freeform music in America even is also a lost musical landscape, maybe not as lost as, not as difficult to access as, say, local African music production, but it is outside of the cloud so far. And maybe we don't have to bring it to Spotify, but maybe we could have it exist on the edges of the commercial businesses so we can, it can be accessible and yet not be representable by entities like Spotify, but rather by DIY and public spaces. So I want to finish by thinking about how to publicize this project apart from the DIY methods that I just described. And I think Wikidata, I'm really excited about it after hearing 2 presentations on it. I think not only we should connect the archives to publicly funded projects such as DPLA or Europeana, but I think Internet Archive and Wikidata, they're interesting because not only they're grant funded, but they're also DIY. They started as public, as non-governmental entities, and their reach is just so much vaster than the reach of even the Smithsonian. So I think it's important to remember. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that, Elena. Thank you especially for that PowerPoint. Your example has made it impossible for any of us to claim that we don't have time to do something now. Okay. And next we'll hear from Mark Williams.
Hi, thank you very much. Is this going? We're on? Cool. You can hear me? Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I was going to stand up, but I think I need to see my slides here. I'm going to really bang through some slides. I made them on a Mac, and they're not being screened on a Mac, so I hope I recognize them. But yeah, they look okay. I'm going to talk about the Media Ecology Project, which is we're really honestly trying to create what I would call a virtuous cycle, in which by virtue of having access to archival, time-based media, we grow scholarship about that media, both traditional, whatever that means, but also computationally enhanced. We produce metadata that makes the archival collections more searchable and discoverable, and we help to save these media as instances of public memory. So I'm going to bang through the slides. They're informative. It's also a little bit of advocacy. Our goals will take a village, and this is a great village. So I hope we can do some things. This is our WordPress site, which essentially talks about the foundations of the project, but also some of the grants that we've received. Very happy to have an overview of the project in this great collection that was co-edited by Charles Ackland and Eric Hoyt about the digital humanities and media history. I frame the project in terms of modernity. All of the media that we study, that we tend to study, are part of modernity, and my favorite description of modernity is from the great French poet Baudelaire, who called modernity a combination of the ephemeral, the contingent, and the fugitive. We have so much work to do on the fugitive, and I say giddy up. So various contexts and premises, most digital tools made for the sciences, crying need in the arts and humanities. If every institution tries to do everything, we're doomed. So we need to think creatively, think forward, act collaboratively. These historical materials are going to disappear. Most people don't realize that, particularly maybe our students who see 1,000 new cat videos an hour, and they can't imagine that moving image culture, for example, is anything but ubiquitous and eternal, and both things are just wrong. So we need to wake people up to that, but we also need to forge new directions for the academic and scholarly community to give back to the archives. It can't just be a one-way trip. So we want to augment preservation goals via more online access. We want to add value back to the archives and libraries. Our scholars and academics can make these materials more searchable, can make materials searchable across archives. These are two huge value adds. Can even become part of the workflow if the archives are interested. So the best first users can help to advocate for what to digitize next and why. These are three value adds before we're really doing significant scholarship. I call this due diligence. Cool. All right, so that's what I just said. So MEP is a triangle of tools and platforms. Media Thread, which comes out of Columbia University and produces a capacity to make time-based annotations. That's really the kind of searchability and discoverability we want to advocate for. We can produce those annotations and push them out to this amazing digital publishing platform from the University of Southern California called Scalar. And once it's in Scalar, you can link to anything on the Magic Box and really contextualize things. But we can also work to build vocabularies that people can share and actually have common vocabularies so that these different aspects of search and discoverability are in fact communal, and the different scholars contribute to one another's work. We hang on to the metadata that's produced. The archives host their own materials. They're the best curators and handlers of that. And by virtue of this kind of triangle and then additional computational tools, we can try to create the future that we're describing. So we want to realize a sustainability project regarding media history as public memory. Every archivist I have ever talked to understands this. They get it. They want to be part of this, and that's our battery, is the enthusiasm of the archives. Develop networked scholarship in relation to this online content, promote and get more people to understand this dynamic ecology of historical media, support the essential work of the archives, engage primary research, and innovate new forms of scholarship and publication. So DH is a complicated term. I actually love that it's kind of messy. People can't give you one definition of DH. But what it means is we're working across disciplines from a lot of different directions. And the first thing to make DH work is you have to respect one another. You have to understand you're working across disciplines, recognize there are going to be little frictions that arise as a result, maintain collegiality, and just find the new research questions that make things go. In terms of the traditions of DH, a lot of DH is focused on word culture. And I love word culture. I was an English major. But if we're dealing with time-based media, we're dealing with other kinds of objects, and we really need to innovate the ways to deal with those other kinds of objects. So Media Thread sort of looks like this. It's a classroom platform. It's divvied up into different courses, if you will. And if you have a collection or an emphasis, we can call that a course and start to populate it and start to create time-based annotations. A lot of our work is with moving image culture, but I am a firm believer in the significance of intermediality. And in fact, my new favorite term in which to think about that comes from the theorist Bakhtin, who talked about chronotopes and the significance of historical moments where there's a combination of newsreels plus radio plus something else plus the newspapers, and it forms a kind of a chronotope that we need to understand better, and we can really facilitate these kinds of understandings. So for sound culture and for radio culture, same kind of capacity. You create time-based annotations, manual time-based annotations, but one of our goals is to facilitate how the manual time-based annotations can help train the algorithms to produce machine learning annotations and see how that can really super generate search and discoverability. This is not quite what Scalar looks like now. That's like Scalar 1.0 and now they're 2.0. But you see how it facilitates a different way to put together linked data. And that's really part of the main significance of the time-based annotations, is to facilitate these linked data search and discoverability practices where you're not just doing a flyover of the titles of a collection, you're searching within the texts themselves and coming up with a whole other way to imagine what the scholarship and the future availability will be. Scalar has beautiful data in terms of their visualizations, so that's certainly a nice thing. And this is what Onomy looks like. So Onomy, this is my little joke. It's like taxonomy without the tax. I live and work in New Hampshire. You get bonus points if you take the tax away, right? Government joke. Perfect audience. But it really is to create vocabularies that we can share and deploy, in a fairly common way, which will actually enhance so much of the search and discoverability. These are our metadata standards. We are very strongly open. In relationship to the presentations yesterday, we're all about RDF and JSON and creating those triples and making those kinds of search capacities viable. Delighted to be working with the Radio Preservation Task Force. We are actively pursuing relationships with different archives, one of which I'll tell you about in a second. And we're working toward a special issue of the Journal of E-Media Studies, which is also published at Dartmouth, about some of the activities of the Preservation Task Force. We have an amazing project with the National Archives that really came to us because of some brilliant grad students who recognized a new opportunity to study what I call the film studio none of us know. Everybody knows MGM and Warner Brothers, but the U.S. Information Agency produced like 18,000 films. And under these curious circumstances whereby, by and large, they were forbidden to be seen within the United States. That's no longer the case, but it means that there are scholars in other parts of the world who have been thinking about and studying these USIA films for a long time. We're a networked scholarly platform. We can imagine engaging scholars from other parts of the world to start to teach the United States about its own cultural project. That's pretty exciting. And of course it has many audio components as well, including the Voice of America, which has materials both at the National Archives and the Library of Congress. So we're incredibly excited about that. Most of our grant money has been to develop tools for moving image culture. So we've got this semantic annotation tool whereby you can create time-based annotations for different geometric parts of the frame that will really lead to more granular, kinds of search and discovery. And very excited to be working with some incredibly gifted colleagues in computer science who are trying to teach the machines how to identify objects and actions, but also other kinds of textuality like audio text, written text, etc. And we are reaching out to people who have some coding wherewithal and some interest to help develop these other kinds of machine reading capacities regarding sound culture. So we know that we can help with speech and music discrimination. This is part of what came up yesterday with the conversations about pop-up archive, which is really great at spoken word, but unfortunately is also going away sometime soon. It was reported yesterday. We can work with different kinds of diarization of speakers, separate speakers. That's really a challenge to get the machines to recognize there are different people talking and how do you parse them. But also the tools that my colleague Michael Casey, who's a brilliant computer scientist at Dartmouth and who's different from Mike Casey at Indiana, is kind of a legend in this. My Michael Casey developed this really great kind of sonic culture toolkit that we work to parse sound culture, but we also have some tricks to make it work for moving image culture as well. So, our goals. Advocate for digitization, and all archivists know that it's a water wheel. Once it's not digitize and you're done. Right, it's digitize and then migrate. But there are a lot of people working on those challenges. Work to develop a scholarly, secure tier of access to online collections. The time is now for this, and there's a lot of interest in trying to move forward, and we would love for people to get together and make that happen. Help to drive 21st century scholarship, raise awareness about the endangered status, get some new pedagogy, get scholars to recognize that they have an obligation to create search and discoverability metadata in their scholarship. Engage in this incredible dialectic between close reading and distant reading. The arts and humanities, all about close reading. The computational studies, all about scale, That's literally a dialectic, and we can learn from that. We can really move the conversation. And develop new approaches that enable crowdsourcing. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Just wanted to say that I just got word from Josh Shepard that Charles Hardy, who was to have been on this panel, had to cancel on very short notice. However, he is alive and well, just not here. So any of you know him, that's the story there, excuse me. So finally to our last panelist, all the way over there, who hails from a area of radio that is storied and vital, but I think also misunderstood and underappreciated. That's shortwave. So Thomas Witherspoon.
Thank you. First of all, it's a real honor to serve on this distinguished panel, and I was just telling Josh yesterday that I feel a little out of place here because I'm not an academic, I'm not a professional archivist, yet here I am. And I'm also from rural North Carolina, and I'm going to try to speak quickly, and that doesn't always work very well. But during my undergraduate studies, I worked every year in an archives department of our university, and I think it's there where I sort of became passionate about preserving, important pieces of work. And I did my graduate studies in anthropology at the London School of Economics. And today I write about communications, all aspects of it, the history, the content, the culture. And I blog on a blog called the Shortwave Listening Post. We have about 7,000 daily readers. And so I'm particularly fascinated with shortwave radio, and I usually tell people when they ask what I do, I'll say I'm a radio anthropologist. And sometimes they back away from me. You know, for those of you who don't know, shortwave radio is a medium for international communications, and it's not hindered by borders. It doesn't care who's in power in what country, and it literally blankets our Earth, and all you need is a $20 receiver, and you can be at the South Pole and receive a station that emanates from Japan or the US or France. I work a lot with enthusiasts in the shortwave radio world, and every year I attend a fest in a convention in Philadelphia where a lot of others there are interested in shortwave radio and international broadcasting. And many years ago, we had a forum topic about preserving off-air recordings of shortwave radio broadcasts, because people, you know, enthusiasts back in the day during the Cold War and earlier have, you know, they started recording on magnetic media, and now those things are starting to deteriorate, and we wanted a way that we could encourage people to digitize these things and share them in some way. Afterwards, not a lot happened because we never really, you know, we didn't bring this to fruition, so I just decided to do it myself, and I created the Shortwave Radio Audio Archive. This archive is, we have hundreds and hundreds of off-air recordings from various shortwave radio broadcasters and sometimes also AM broadcasters. It's set up, though, as a podcast. So when you subscribe to this via iTunes or the RSS feed, anytime we upload a recording, it automatically downloads that recording. We don't have any introductions or anything like that. It's just the recording. And quite a lot of the 2,000 people who subscribe to this keep the entire archive of recordings at their home. That's a lot of off-site, you know, recordings. And so anyway, that's how we propagate it. And you can visit that website at shortwavearchive.com. Like, again, it's funded 100% by me. It's not affiliated with a university or anything, and I'm not super risk averse when I put things out there. But by and large, these are off-air recordings from international broadcasters, you know, and a lot of propaganda and other interesting things. And I also work with another site called, it's actually a new team that we formed called the Radio Spectrum Archive. How many of you, with a raise of hands, how many of you have heard of Radio Spectrum recordings before? Oh, yes, okay, so at the end of this, you'll all have your hands up. Since the early days of radio transmitting, we've had efforts to preserve recordings, and these are audio recordings of a broadcaster on a particular frequency, a particular day, and possibly a particular topic. Today, through the use of software-defined radios, these are little radios that look like an external hard drive, and you can hook it up to your computer with a USB cable, and then you hook up an external antenna to it. And it is a radio that's controlled by your computer, and you can do just kind of crazy things with it. You can record spectrum. Instead of one frequency, one broadcaster, I can record, say, the entire FM band all at once, or the entire AM broadcast band all at once, or you know, a couple of shortwave bands all at once, all dozens and dozens and dozens of stations on there, and the static in between, everything. And later, you can tune through it as if it were live. I've got a short video. I narrate in this video. This is on our website. And just to kind of give you a flavor of what this is, and I'll tell you before we start it, what you're looking at on the screen is a software-defined application called HDSDR. It's free, and it can read recordings. This particular recording I'm demonstrating is a unique one. Most of the recordings now are made digitally with a software-defined receiver. This was made in Providence, Rhode Island on May 1st, 1986 by an enthusiast who basically hacked his receiver and connected it to a hi-fi VCR and recorded the intermediate frequency and then played it back through his radio so he could tune through it later, like time travel. And he very kindly, a couple years ago, digitized those tapes and put them in a form that we can read them on this. And so if you'd like to go ahead.
NBC News, I'm Kevin Gordon. President Reagan himself says, even with the vast resources available to the United States, there is no way of knowing just how bad the Chernobyl nuclear plant disaster really is. While the accident is the talk of the Western world, there are still vast portions of the Soviet Union that have no idea that anything is wrong. Stuart Newbarth with Stanford University says the only people in the Soviet Union who were told about Chernobyl are in Moscow and Kiev.
We've been monitoring these broadcasts since Tuesday, and there's been absolutely no mention of anything connected to a nuclear accident. The Siberian people don't know anything about this.
The fire is said to still be burning out
So
of
again,
control.
this is a recording that you can tune through as if it were live radio. This is what the AM band sounded like in Providence, Rhode Island on May 1st, 1986. I'll tune to another frequency here.
In Europe, Speaks told us all the European leaders are still expected to come to the summit in Tokyo this weekend. Vic Rapner, ABC News, with the president in Bali.
A hurricane tracking satellite is scheduled to be launched from the Kennedy Space Center this evening. It's the first launch there since the Challenger space shuttle explosion. One Challenger investigator says examination directed proves a rocket joint failed, again pointing to a problem with the O-rings. Los Angeles library officials are not sure what books were destroyed in the big fire in the downtown library. The fire department says about 80% of the 2 million books were saved. Starting today, May 1st in Florida, you can pick up stronger medicines at a drugstore.
Okay, and I'll just tune through the rest of this spectrum here so you can see what stations are actually on.
Are more potent than over-the-counter medicines. The pharmacist also can charge fees for this extra service.
And wake up ready to go. Use only as directed. Compose.
Around my cheeks, but my forehead, nose, and chin are oily.
And we can pause it there if you like. So that is a spectrum recording. So, you know, this is actually sort of a rougher copy of a spectrum recording. It was made on a hi-fi VCR in 1986, but a lot of the stations on there are no longer on the air. Some of them went off the air 10 years after this was recorded. And I'm willing to bet this is the only copy of this in existence. You know, we still capture things today. In fact, I have at my house about 50 terabytes worth of spectrum recordings. I recorded the last 2 presidential elections. I can go back and relive some and not relive others, but historically speaking, they're still very significant. And I think now, actually, I spend a lot of time capturing the AM broadcast band because it's actually a pretty diverse mediascape. It's pretty rich, context-rich, and we anthropologists love that. And I think today, you know, in the future, people will look back and be able to tune through this. I imagine even in a library, online, somewhere, maybe even in a kiosk, you can have an interface where someone can tune through the spectrum as if it were live. And they'll probably see that now, you know, we were living in this kind of dynamic time where the public was divided and a large percent of the population, you know, lacked some of the critical thinking skills to discriminate between fake and real news. And I think that's something that's playing out on the airwaves right now. So some of our challenges, well, these files are huge. To record the entire AM broadcast band, it sucks up about 2 gigabytes of space for every 1 minute. And space is cheap. You know, hard drives are cheap, but putting those in the cloud or in some sort of, you know, digital format that can be archived is much more difficult, very costly. And so we're trying to figure out ways to do that. Of course, bandwidth makes it difficult to pass these recordings on to each other, especially if you've got large files. And we'd like maybe at some point to turn this into something where we can have an endowment to perhaps fund it, even in some modest way, to keep these recordings in existence. And also, we want to do outreach, stuff like this, so people are aware that Spectrum recordings are out there. So how many people know what a Spectrum recording is now, right? Excellent. So if you have any ideas, please approach me at this conference, because I don't know many of you. Come over, give me your card or something. I'll give you a card, and we can talk. But thank you again very much for allowing me to be here today.
All right, thank you, Thomas, and thank you, all of you. Another hand for our panel, please. All right, so we've got almost half an hour for some good discussion here. There's an extra chair up here if one of the discussants would like to take it. Please don't fight over it. But are you ready? Do you want to just stand up and face the crowd, or how should we do this? Okay. Okay.
I think we should, since I am part of the host institution, I think we should start with the guest.
And not to make you nervous, but we are live streaming, so if you could, try and crane yourself a little ways towards the camera, that might help the people viewing this at home. Or come up here, whatever you like.
I don't know which is the bigger challenge, to say something sensible or to turn in two directions at once.
Okay.
I want to thank this panel very much for pulling me, a curator, into the 21st century. I am fascinated by the multiple definitions of digital curation. I don't know if that's something you want to discuss, but I am going to pose a question, because I come from the material side of curation that has nothing to do with curation. I was interested in every case to hear about your users. I come from a background in the history of technology. The current trend is to say users matter, and these are the historical reasons, the historical cases why. So could you each say something more about the users that you already have or imagine that you will have, and why scale matters to these users?
We don't have to do it alphabetically anymore.
Yes, yeah.
Jump in.
Feels good.
Yeah, I can start. I mean, the users that we're starting with for our pilot projects are scholars and trying to come up with new and innovative research questions to pursue. And we've had fantastic results in that regard. And in fact, some of the research questions, I've never heard of the different methodologies they want to bring to these texts. So the goal overall is to give back to the archives and make them searchable and discoverable, and then see how the public more generally wants to use them as well. But we're starting with the scholarly tier, if you will, and seeing what kind of new methodologies and discoverability that generates.
Well, for me, or for this project, as we imagine the users, we don't have the users obviously yet, but I think we would start with music fans, like people who are interested in independent music or odd music, non-popular music, but that includes scholars of music. Any music historian or music scholar would be interested in this kind of material. So there are two ways to promote it or to distribute it. Is one, to make it public for everybody, for general listener to discover and see and hear, and then another one would be to plug it into the library universe, so the scholars can use it as well. But I think a lot of work needs to be done to promote these kind of ad hoc recordings to scholars, to contextualize them, to make them understand why this kind of cultural production is important.
Well, I'll just say very quickly that, of course, as a public library, our users are anyone and everyone who decides to go to the website, for starters. So while we have a pretty good sense of who uses what types of materials, that doesn't always translate as to customizing the way in which we can present them and serve them. So all that's to say is that we do our best to make things as widely available and discoverable as possible to anyone and everyone. But then we also, and I think this happens more on the sort of flesh and bones human level, is that the staff really is empowered and takes it seriously to go literally into communities such as this. Or if you're working in a, we're making these tools accessible to all sorts of library staff users, so education officers, so to say, or branch librarians who do children's programming, presumably will also have uses for these. So we want to make things really open and then build tools on top that allow smaller user groups to maybe, again, aggregate materials or have packages of things passed on to them by the staff. But I do think in terms of the variety of users, we try and actually go out into different fields to find out what it is people need and how they want to use it. So
the conversations about who our users for Hearing the Americas might be have been really interesting. I sort of came into the project thinking first of students and teachers, but then it became a digital project for the public, which implies a bigger, broader audience and more of a public history kind of project. So, my colleagues in the project have done a bunch of audience testing and elaborating personas, which has been really interesting as somebody who's never done any of that to see that happen. But I think what's the big sort of primary audience at this point are sort of fans and music history buffs, I would say, of which there are many. But the interesting challenge about that for us is that the motivating questions that come up over and over again from those communities sometimes lead to frustration with the collection. In other words, because the motivating questions have to do with the genres that people first think of when they think of early American popular music. So there's a lot of interest in blues music. There's a lot of interest in country music. And even the more savvy members of that community are sometimes surprised that we're really looking at a period before those genres have emerged. And the music sort of surprises them and frustrates them in certain ways. So that's been kind of a big challenge for us to work through. So there are lots of different ways of approaching that problem, but there will be things, sort of hooks, right, designed to sort of pique the interest of that community, but then maybe also open people's eyes and surprise people in interesting ways. So trivia questions that pull people in, playlists is another sort of technique. But I think that is the kind of central challenge of the project. And for me, the shortwave radio audio archive, really, I threw it out there for everyone, anyone who wants to listen to it, people who are nostalgic, historians, people in media studies, any kind of researchers, whoever wants it can have it. Interestingly, though, the publicity we've gotten, which just appeared in my email one day, the Wire magazine in the UK, which is a magazine for musicians, reviewed the Shortwave Radio Archive as a source of material for music and gave us, all kinds of good publicity. And our users kind of jumped from there. That's not one I would have ever thought of, but shortwave radio has kind of an interesting sonic texture, which I find appealing, and evidently others do as well. The Spectrum Archive, at the moment, it's not super practical to share it with everyone just because of the data size, and we just don't have the applications in place to share this. But ideally, I'd like it to be accessible to everyone, perhaps have an online site where people can pull up a recording, like a digital library, and tune through it. That would be the ideal to me.
Well, kind of as a follow-up, kind of as a follow-up to that, as far as engaging with the communities, as you suggested, what are some ways in which you can bring people in and accept kind of feedback from the communities? I think that's a great example you mentioned of letting people tag recordings, for example, but there's a lot of indigenous and like marginalized groups represented in this media, and there's a shared identity there. Are there some potential ways that you can let people kind of enhance the data?
There are, and we're seeking them out, and that was part of my final advocacy bit about crowdsourcing. I think we're interested. I should probably clarify. We're interested in formulating new research questions in an interdisciplinary way. So that tends to mean you want to deal with experts in different fields, but we're absolutely interested in research questions that enable crowdsourcing and other kinds of input. And I was very inspired, the panel before this one was about indigenous and native cultures and their radio cultures. We would love to work with them to formulate a pilot project with various tribes, pan-tribal, kinds of affiliations. And that means that in many cases you'll be dealing with traditional materials that need to be for certain people and not others. And having a capacity to navigate some of those issues of respect regarding traditional cultures is a very important thing. So just being able to say for whom, when, and how can we engage, massive crowdsourcing when it is appropriate. How many fans of time-based culture are there in the world? Billions. I think people, if we can make it clear to them that these materials are going to be lost, but for better annotation and teach them simple ways that they can maybe develop a CAPTCHA kind of app, so that if people have, somebody was talking at the Wikimedia thing, free 5 minutes, you can just go on and help save media history, and make it that simple ultimately. But yeah, we do need governors that can respect certain kinds of content, for sure. Yeah.
I think also in respect to indigenous communities, I know editathons for Wikipedia have been really successful in promoting gender, like women's culture and women's contribution. So something like that for media would be so great to have, to organize the meet and then have people contribute as a particular event. I think it will work.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to the idea of public events. So while in one sense, I think part of your question is addressing, well, how can we get essentially the whole world to chip in? And I think there are tools being developed, and even some that already exist that do that. As institutions, perhaps we haven't put up those projects to the public yet. They haven't been formed in many cases, not everywhere, in some cases. So that's a kind of catching up, or getting, I shouldn't say catch up. I think institutions beat themselves up sometimes. Sometimes it takes a long time to get to a certain place and to do it right, and there's a lot of wrongs along the way. So, but I think big institutions like Nypl are getting to the point where they're going to have tools. There's already been successful projects with text-based things. I don't know if you've ever seen the Menus project that the public library put out, or there's a variety of very well-received public engagement projects. But I would say that what we've discovered is having public programs, maybe the reach isn't 1 million people at a time, but even if it's anywhere from 15 to 210, you've at least, just as you've demonstrated here, introduced exponentially people to ideas and materials they didn't know were there before in an interactive way that we can do in public spaces without feeling like we have to worry about the law as much because we have our own rights. So I would go back to public programming, and thinking smaller before we get bigger is also a useful tool.
Yeah, I would just say, that I think we're, very excited, although maybe also a little nervous about the crowdsourcing potential for the project. It's 20,000 plus recordings, and we're not going to be able to contextualize, even a significant chunk of them, really. So that the ability to allow users to help with that project and contribute to that project is, you know, in some ways what it's all about. On the other hand, you know, there's a curatorial tension there, right? So we have to figure out, we have to navigate how to maintain control, or whether to maintain control, or, you know, what to do about that. But I think we are excited for that.
Yeah, and I can say that in terms of the Spectrum Archive, one of the things I imagine, if you can imagine when you have a recording with just dozens and dozens of broadcasters on it with all kinds of content, at some point, hopefully, there will be a way that individual broadcasts can be tagged, and people, as they're listening to it, can make notes and keep those notes in the broadcast recordings. And that's something I'm interested in. And, you know, a lot of, especially in urban areas, well, and actually in rural areas, AM broadcasters are often serving a diaspora or, you know, a particular group, and that would be something that they could keep and be used in other archives.
I'm also not an expert in digital curation. I'm at the American Folk Life Center here at the Library of Congress, and I've loved hearing about all of the projects. The diversity is amazing. I'm also struck by the diversity of the different contexts in which everyone is working in. I mean, both large institutions and as individuals, devoted individuals. And I'm curious, do you feel that this field is at a point where this networking effort, I mean, is it happening? Are issues being identified or threads that are being identified beyond sort of the individual projects or the, you know, opportunistic projects that come our way? I mean, you all have different funders. And I was also struck by how people are supporting themselves doing this. And I know funders often drive what some of the issues are, who the audiences are. I mean, you have to shape your project to feed them. But are we at a point where we can begin identifying what the central issues are, what the Radio Preservation Task Force can do, what government or larger institutional entities can do? I'd just be curious to hear from all of you.
It's a great question, and I can only give a partial answer, but there's a little bit of another advocacy point. In my experience with different grant-giving institutions, there needs to be more awareness about the significance of network scholarship. And a major significance to that is that the local is no longer so local. And when you put a lot of locals together, you have transnational significance, you know, and the AAPB is a great example of this, right? I think that's part of its historic importance, is that it's collating different archives from different public broadcasting stations and putting them in a position to talk to one another and for scholars to learn across them. And in a lot of grant-making conversations that I've been part of, and I think some of this is maybe generational, people have not internalized this yet, that network scholarship means that the local can matter as much as any big network or anything else. And if you really start to fund local projects, we're going to change how we understand the history of media. I mean, it's just, that's where we are now. And I think that needs to be underscored, yeah.
I guess we're going. I was at the task force last year, and there was a debate at the metadata panel between Ken Friedman, who's the head of FMU, and Archivists. And basically, it was kind of an impossible block where he was saying, I just want to put up music online right away. I don't care about metadata. I don't care about lists, controlled descriptors. And the archivists were saying, how can you do that? We have to have a list first, and then you put music on. And I think at this conference, I now feel that there's a meeting point, that there's a way to informally coordinate between professional archivists and independent collectors and projects that are maybe informal, but eventually will be put into this larger universe with the ID numbers. And I think, I guess for me, it seems like Internet Archive and Wikidata would be the place to bring these two entities together. So people can continue the independent projects and informal collection and still know that eventually through crowdsourcing or some kind of grants, everything will be part of the same universe. We'll see.
Yeah, I think there's a time in it. This is a time to do this. I also do note that I think large public institutions like the one where I come from, I would say there's a gap growing between the speed and agility with which smaller efforts or something like Wikipedia or something can operate in a way that is creating, it's not even going to be a question of bigger institutions catching up. I think it's just going to be, there might be some different purposes served in that landscape. I don't know what they are, but I can't imagine any sort of policy change in the next 2 or 3 years where something comes down and says, hey, we can share all of this stuff either freely with everyone or with even through a tier, which I think is a better approach for getting at stuff, but also limits the number of people. So I think there's a lot of work to be done there, and it may be that meeting point isn't actually people trying to collaborate on the exact same thing, but trying to find the strengths around that circle that puts it together, if that makes any sense. So I don't know, that's what I would say.
Yeah, I'm a total newbie to this field, so it's hard for me to see, the sort of obstacles or opportunities for that sort of networking and collaboration. I mean, I would say that the sort of the focus on the archive itself, for somebody who doesn't generally think that way as a scholar, the focus on the archive promotes a kind of interdisciplinarity, at least, and a kind of, I don't know if it's quite networked scholarship, but it's moving in that direction. I mean, I'm a historian of Argentina, and I'm in the room with historians of the US and musicologists, and we're all trying to figure out how to make sense of this material and present it in a way that makes sense. So in that sense, I do see it as a kind of possibility for forging those connections.
Yeah, and for me, this is all about discovery, finding out the other side. I a lot of times in what I'm doing, I feel kind of alone. I'm there doing my thing. I don't have colleagues I can turn to easily. And yesterday at one of the Cold War forums, one of the presenters was talking about various sources of source material, and he mentioned the buffs, the people, the enthusiasts out there, and that's the realm I'm in, and I'm very, I'm humbled to be here, and more than that, I really congratulate the Radio Preservation Task Force and Josh for reaching out to people like me and not just staying in the world of academia to bring these together, because I think there's a incredible synergy between, that's how you discover that all these things are out there. So yeah, I think that's the power of having a conference like this.
Thank you. Yeah. We still have a few minutes left, and I'd like to, throw it open to the rest of you. If there are any questions from you, put up your hand. We'll get the microphone to you. There's one, Danielle.
Hi, to the gentleman on the end, in the blue shirt. You'd be surprised at how many anthropologists are drawn to this field. I've met several, so you're not alone. But how far back do your archives go?
Okay, so the shortwave radio archives, the audio recordings go back to about, I think, the late 50s. And we have quite a few in the 60s, a whole lot in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And actually, we record them today. In fact, a lot of us make an effort to record stations. For example, the Voice of Turkey during the Gezi Park protests didn't mention anything about the Gezi Park protests for a week after they were happening. It was headline news. We try to record things like that, so we have a lot of current recordings as well. The Spectrum Archive, really, I don't know how deep that is yet. This 1986 recording I played is probably one of the older ones. The technology hasn't been around for very long. The technology has been around since about 2005 to do these digitally and very easily. So the bulk of our recordings are from about 2005 until now.
Tom, I have a quick follow-up. How do we find that YouTube thing that you played. I've been searching for it desperately. So.
Okay, yes. So go to spectrumarchive.org, and it's right on the front page.
It's also been tweeted on the hashtag.
Okay.
Yay.
How many hits for that in the last 20 minutes is what I want to know.
Let me check.
Thank you. This is great. The first comment that praised this panel for expanding our view of what digital curation is on the money. But coming out of the field of digital curation or digital preservation as it's emerged from libraries and archives over the last 15 or 20 years, I still want to make a pitch, and it's in the title of this conference or this session is digital curation. I'll make a pitch for connecting these diverse projects to some pretty good thinking about how to keep digital collections alive. I mean, it's not a solved problem, but it's one in which curators working in libraries and archives internationally have developed methods, techniques. And it's not only about the metadata, it's really about redundancy, it's about standards, it's about partnerships with curatorial units in which their mission is to keep things alive. So what was mind-blowing for me was the ability to think about DIY, to think about fan-based material without denying the relevance of standards and best practices that libraries and archives have been developing internationally. So there is a need to foster that cross-conversation so that this really critical stuff doesn't get lost. If it's in your bedroom at some point, you know, I don't want you to get hit by a bus. And literally things like this happen. People estate sales and computers from the 1990s are opened up, and lo and behold, it's valuable raw material. So what we want to do is connect the dots between traditional what is I could call traditional digital curation thinking and DIY and innovative new applications. So it's a pitch more than anything else.
Anyone else?
Can I respond to that?
Oh, please.
Just one point to make. I'm also blown away by the professional approach to curation, and Library of Congress archives. I worked in the archives; they're amazing. But we also have to remember that, for example, environmental pages of the White House were also government archive, and it's not there anymore. So I think redundancy of government and outside of government archives also required.
Yeah, it's a great point, and we're so grateful to be working with archivists. As you know, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel. We want to work with what the archives want to work with, and at the same time, it comes back a little bit to the crowdsourcing kinds of issues where certain professionals want to use controlled vocabularies, and we're happy to help in that regard. But for true search and discoverability, we want to know the terms that ordinary folks use for search and discoverability. So there are always these little dialectics, you know, that we're trying to navigate, and that's a great point to raise. Absolutely.
Okay, I think we have time for one more if it's quick. Anyone? No? Okay. Well, in radio speak, the little no. Oh, can't see through this pillar here, please. It's a marginalized community over here. So, no? Okay.
Okay.
All right then. In radio speak, the little clock on the wall or the little clock in my pocket is telling us that it's 12:30. It's time for lunch. Please, let's have a hand for this wonderful panel. Thank you all for coming, and we'll see you back here real soon.